Hello and welcome to CherrySTEM number 30. And before we begin our podcast episode, a holiday-ish edition based on food, family, fun, and fasting, let me take your attention for a moment and direct it to the page that you are looking at, which is patreon.com/AnnaCherry. This podcast is brought to you by listeners such as yourself and mostly by patrons. And if you'd like to support our endeavors and get awesome goodies as a reward, I would recommend the Challenger tier. Now, those images for Challenger and Hardcore may not be very recognizable because Patreon is working with me. The Trust and Safety team is working with me to make sure that no childrens are offended by the pictures that you see before you. So the Challenger and the Hardcore images have been replaced, but in my heart, that's what they are. And so I will continue showing that to you guys. I would recommend the Challenger tier. You get involved in an after show hangout with us where we go over some special articles that we don't cover in public chat in the podcast, but patrons get special access as well as a video convo chat with us, covering anything, any questions, or anything else that might have come up during the podcast. It's a good time. Check it out. Do it if you can without hardship. I would highly recommend it, and it really helps us out. Patreon.com/AnnaCherry to support this podcast. If you would like to donate to the stream directly, you can support the stream on streamlabs.com/AnnaCherry. We currently do not have YouTube monetization. We do not have super chats. If you want to stick it to YouTube, that's a great way to do it. Go to streamlabs.com/AnnaCherry. If you want to donate and have your questions or comments read out loud during the chat podcast, go ahead and do it. All right. Now, with all that out of the way,
we might have to add another little circle there for for Schrodinger.
I was already thinking about that. Yes, we are in the process of being adopted by a feral kitten who doesn't act like a feral kitten whatsoever. And that's a story for another time. But that's why the podcast is 18 minutes late right now, because he was getting in my way when I was trying to prepare all the stories. So, all right, let's just jump into. Let's just get into it. So the topic today is essentially my way of kind of covering the Thanksgiving. We weren't able to do a stream before Thanksgiving, so this is post Thanksgiving, and I'm sure you guys have stuffed yourself full, and you probably feel like you couldn't eat another bite, and you probably shouldn't. And we'll talk to you about why. Fasting is perhaps the fountain of youth, according to a CNN article. It is perhaps that, and there's some really compelling research to back up that theory. Of course, there's also things like emotional eating, dealing with holidays, family, food, stress. All of that sometimes can be a ball of a mess, and we'll go over some strategies on how to curb emotional eating, which leads into an idea of willpower, and that is an article that I will be saving for patrons. We'll be talking about the limbic system, the prefrontal cortex, the driver and the passenger, and things like that. So that should be an interesting article to cover in the after show for patrons. But during the show, we'll be talking about food, fasting, family, how to deal with family, and also how to have fun and how to sort of deal with the seasonal affective disorder. We'll go more into that around Christmas time, maybe in December podcasts, but we'll do a little primer today. But mostly I'd like to focus on how to navigate family situations and fasting and food. So post Thanksgiving, pre Christmas mix, melange. So that's what we're going to be doing. So let's begin, I suppose, with gluttony.
So we'll be covering the 7 deadly sins now.
We'll be covering gluttony and fasting. So essentially, how do you overcome emotional eating and take back power with food, especially during the winter times when It is cold, and there have been studies done to indicate that when people feel cold, they also feel socially unloved. There is a connection between the warmth and being warm in your body and feeling a social connection.
Did you know that your temperature regulation is related to kappa opioids?
Well, of course it is.
It makes perfect sense, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
because heat tolerance, of course it would
Yeah,
be.
exactly.
Yeah, so yeah, there you go. Essentially, in the cold winter months, it is especially important to come together with family and community, which is probably why we do have all of these winter holidays like Thanksgiving, Christmas, etc. Um, and the downside of that is, though, when you don't necessarily have a strong social connection, which that's pretty much the case for most of us in the Western world, in the modern world, we are fractured and not whole at all. We essentially end up being very isolated, little islands onto ourselves a lot of times. And it's more in the rural, I would say, more undeveloped communities, even, where you have a more communal attitude, and people come together and help each other out because people are not as individualistic culturally, but they're also not as self-sufficient in terms of finances or what have you. So a lot of farmer societies or third world societies, you end up having people come together a lot more, and it's sort of a byproduct of our civilization is that, and the social media, internet, etc., that we're kind of islands unto ourselves, and it's sometimes difficult to connect, especially in the current very divisive climate. If you don't agree with someone on one tiny little thing, then you feel like it's okay to exclude them, and people don't feel like they belong anywhere, and it's kind of a problem, really. So we do end up having a lot of emotional overeating, because we do help ourselves with food that is a comfort. And a lot of that essentially goes back to our childhood, I would say, or at least some of the arguments in this article seem to agree with that as well. So, some quotes here. Of course, Peter
DeVry?
DeVry. Gluttony is an emotional escape, a sign something is eating us. And of course, there's also the emotional sort of intensity of loneliness, and we get compelled really strongly sometimes to eat and to go for comfort food. Like, I'm sure all of you have experienced this when you're not so well off, or you're sick, or you have had a bad day, and you think about what to eat. Your mind goes to a comfort food place that probably links to your childhood, and things that were given to you as a reward, like sweets by family, or special occasion meals that were baked. Usually it's, carbs, fat, salt, all of that really dopaminergic good stuff that we tend to seek out in excess when we're not feeling very well. And the intensity of that desire, of that craving for comfort food, can be abnormally strong. And that comes from the emotional need. Something else is behind it. So St. Francis de Sales quote, or de Sales, or however, I'm apparently bad with all these names. The spirit cannot endure the body when overfed, but if underfed, the body cannot endure the spirit. And of course, we have good old Proverbs. Better to eat a dry crust of bread with peace of mind than have a banquet in a house full of trouble. So there's throughout time we've associated eating and overeating with emotions, and something eating at us. And of course, there's ways to deal with it. A good way to start off, if you have an emotional overeating problem, is to write a list of foods that you're drawn to, and then go over whether they're healthy or unhealthy. And in that case, you still have your comfort foods, but you can limit it to the ones that are slightly on the healthier side, if that is something that you do have in your list of options. Once you write it all out and actually look at it and see the level of unhealthiness that there might be, or come up with alternatives that you actually do like that happen to be healthy, that would be a great way to start course correcting into a healthier direction, if food and overeating or emotional overeating is a problem for you. And of course, there's chemical imbalances. That's a big thing, and a lot of times I would say the chemical is dopamine that is imbalanced, a mix of dopamine and serotonin, of course. And your gut bacteria affects what you crave. And things like exercise change your mental state, which has all sorts of effects, downstream effects. So you can actually change what you crave based on diet and changing your diet, based on exercise and then changing your diet in the first place. So it's a bit of a feedback loop sometimes that you have to just sort of break, which I understand can be difficult when you're under emotional duress. And a good way to really get to the bottom of things, of what is going on. So the food side is one aspect of it. You can write out the foods, determine which ones are healthier, and try to stick with those when you're feeling cravings.
And a big deal also is always when you're shopping. It's what you buy that is important. So first off, I mean, everybody should already know you don't go shopping when you're hungry
Good
because
point.
you'll buy the shittiest possible foods, and then just make sure that you just don't have access to the things that you don't want to have access to, instead of relying on bullshit ideals of self control and things like that, which are
Willpower.
willpower.
We'll
It's
talk
like
about that.
because sometimes you're going to be at lower willpower points. It's just
Hmm.
like when you're shooting a bow and arrow or a gun or whatever. If you're firing left, you just correct to the right a little. Don't you don't have to sit there and just focus so much on fixing that fire into the left a little bit thing. It's sometimes just correcting
In
is
the other
is the
direction,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly, is the better and more expedient and more efficient course to accomplish what it is that you're attempting to accomplish.
Yes, putting a lock on your fridge works really well. But believe it or not, surprisingly, locking your snack cabinet after a certain hour, putting the key away, or having someone else do it for you, or having a combination lock. I'm sure there's apps. I'm sure there's an app for everything. I'm sure there's an app to help you randomize a key combination or something. But yeah, actually, legitimately changing what you input through shopping, as well as physically limiting your access to things, can be the willpower that you need. And that's the physical sort of the active side of how what to physically do. Now we can also control or try to um, mitigate some of the problems that come from the emotional side. And I would recommend a following exercise. When you are feeling bad and you're feeling a temptation and you want to give in to a food, and you've done all the things, you've distanced yourself from it, you've done everything that you can, but you're still feeling these cravings, I would recommend take just 5 minutes and then tell yourself, I will get my sweetie, I will get the thing that I want. Just 5 minutes. The price to pay for getting those goodies is to write down these three things. First, what does the emotion feel like? Because you're not just hungry, there's also something else. So try to identify what that emotion feels like. Describe it. Just write it out, or out loud to yourself. But I prefer writing it. It helps. Then, secondly, how do you experience the emotion in the body? What are you physically experiencing? Because that's the 1-2 punch. You are having a physical reaction, a craving, a something. But if you look behind it, there is an emotion and a physical feeling that isn't just hunger. Try to find that. And then thirdly, what is it asking of you? What does it want? What is that emotion? What is it trying to do? So just having the simple 5-minute exercise of writing out, what does the emotion feel like? How does it feel in your body? And what could it be asking of you? Can help you start to detangle or start to see patterns in things that ail you. And that would be a very helpful way to begin to.
Treat the cause instead of the symptoms. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
And that way, once you know what it is that's leading to that point, you can start to work on deeper causes, and that instead of trying to fix everything at the end after shit's gone wrong, you can keep it from going wrong.
Exactly. And on that note, though, what is eating, feeding, gluttony? We're talking about all this. Well, what about fasting? It's interesting how I believe a comedian, not sure who they were, I would reference them by name otherwise, but I've forgotten the comedian. But they were talking about the fact that every other religion except Christianity or, well, essentially, let's look at the three Abrahamic religions: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. It seems like Islam and Judaism have fasting as part of a religious holiday, while in the West, anyway, the more Christian traditions that we have in the West are involved with gluttony instead of fasting. So the opposite. Which is in Russia, for instance, Orthodox Christianity, and other areas of the world where there's Christianity, they do actually fast as well, because the Bible does talk about fasting. And so the joke the comedian was saying that they seem to have focused on not the fasting part that the saints or Jesus or whatever did, but the big dinner. Like, it's like, wait a
Yeah,
minute.
dinner. Yeah, there we go.
Can you back up to dinner
You
part?
fasted for 30 days after dinner. Wait a minute, back up. You had dinner. Okay, well, there we go. Now that's our holiday.
Exactly, exactly. So there's this juxtaposition between gluttony and fasting, and it seems like other religions, or the original,
It's our culture. It's our culture specifically.
right? But it seems like religions have baked in them, and as you've heard our podcast, if you have heard our podcast before, you do know that we approach religious texts with the idea of it was written or combined into writing at a time, at a place where these ideas were useful for those people for whatever reason. They had some adaptive cause. There was a reason why these, don't eat pork, or don't have butt sex, or, don't splooge on the ground. Like a variety of things that seem completely ridiculous that are in the Bible now. At the time, they probably were what was needed for that society to function at its best, at its peak capacity or peak
Yeah,
ability.
whatever. I mean, like, there's a time when you barely have any people, and you need more people as workers, as fighters, etc. And then there's a time when you're on an island, and everybody's dying and eating each other because there's not enough food. And in one case, having babies is the very best thing, and then in the other case, having babies is the very worst thing. So
Hmm.
a religion on an island could start out with them believe.
Cannibalizing babies.
Right. Well, no, they could start out with that you're supposed to produce and multiply, and
Oh,
then they
right.
could be
Start out,
and
yeah.
then they destroy themselves if they don't change by the time that they hit the capacity of that island. So it's there are things that are valuable,
But they're outdated.
but then they can become outdated and become just as destructive as they were helpful.
Exactly, and I think we're kind of at that point now again. So why would you have fasting for 30 days? Like a long ass time. Like Ramadan is essentially a feast after the fast, right?
I don't know. I think so. Maybe.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially, variety of religions have fasting. As
I thought it was just fasting.
for like a long as, oh wait, no, Ramadan is they can eat but only at night or something. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Who knows?
Who knows?
This
Point
is
is,
impossible to know. There's no way to find out.
there's no way to find out. There's we can never have an answer to this question. But my point being, which I'm sure you get my freaking point, which is religions have baked in them this fasting thing. Why? What could possibly be the point? And also, most of you I hear asking, isn't it unhealthy to not eat for 40 days? Ain't you going to die if you don't eat for 40 days?
Well, 30 days. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, since you're on YouTube, open a separate tab, type in fasting for 30 days, and you're gonna have like a lot of YouTube videos. There's gonna be a tremendous amount of experiments that people have done of fasting for 30 days. It's called a water fast, where all you have is water. It's not, whenever I've said water fast before, people are like, you're not drinking water for 30 days?
Yeah, that's right. No, no liquids for 30 days. That's going to work out really well. Yeah.
No, it means fasting except for water. And sometimes it's also a black coffee fast. So you will have nothing but black coffee,
Well, water and black.
obviously. Well, you need
Drink
water
nothing
to
but
make
black
black
coffee.
coffee.
Drink nothing but
Just
black
chew the
coffee.
grounds. Just chew.
For 30 days. This is a new kind of diet right there.
Hollywood's taken with the set.
Yeah.
All right, so a water fast for 30 days is something that people have been doing and putting YouTube videos up for quite some time now, and it actually is quite good for you. So we have the fast aspect of it. So 30 days, nothing but water. First 5 days suck, but after that, it's actually kind of amazing, from what I hear. I've never done a 30-day fast personally. But there's also fasting mimicking diet, which is well, that's like advanced level. So beginner level is intermittent fasting. Then you can have intermittent fasting and fasting mimicking diet, which is or pills, etc., and diet. You get herbs and small meals of specific calorie counting, and then you also have like advanced level, which is just 30 days no food.
I'd say that a fasting mimicking diet where you do reduced amounts of food is probably
Probably the
the
beginner,
hardest. No, I think it's the
most
hardest. I
advanced.
think
Yeah,
that if you're going to do I mean,
that's
intermittent
what I
fasting is where
felt
like eating other
towards it.
day,
Yeah.
every other day is one
Right.
thing, or stopping eating at an early point in the day
Hmm.
is another method that people use. There's a variety of ways in which basically you're restricting all caloric intake for a period of time, and then doing that fairly regularly for intermittent fasting is probably that's probably one of the easiest ones and probably fits in people's lives the best because one of the things that we've done is the 5 day water fast a few times, and that's it can be very disruptive, but it's also very strong. In other words, it's probably the strongest and most direct way to do the
In the least
fasting
amount of
thing
time.
in the least amount of time, and that is you just straight,
Just
it's
don't
just,
eat for 5 days. Just drink
exactly.
water
Water and, well, black coffee.
and black coffee if you have
That's
to
one
work.
thing. Yeah, if you have to exist at all, then yeah, black coffee is very helpful. I know that was a like I usually hate black coffee, but my God, it was a beautiful thing during each one of the fasts that we've done.
Speaking of thankfulness, that's a great segue. As soon as we're done with the fasting element, let's go into thankfulness.
But yeah, I think you were bringing up why
Hmm.
fasting? What's the
Yes, why fasting?
use?
But you brought up something really interesting, which is essentially the highlight of the fasting idea. It's not what you eat, but a system of telling you when to eat. So that's the whole thing about fasting is that it's not about
Intermittent fasting, you mean?
intermittent fasting. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
intermittent fasting, which is the sweet spot, essentially is intermittent fasting. That is, like as you were saying, that is the beginner mode, the one that would most likely fit in everybody's diet or lifestyle, whatever. It is probably the easiest thing to do to begin getting the benefits. And the benefits, what are they? Well, intermittent fasting, which is essentially the definition is the practice of going without food for an undefined period of time, has health benefits. It can prevent heart disease, it can speed up fat loss, it can even slow or reverse aging. So, a lot of it has to do with insulin and oxidative stress and inflammation, which gets reduced by these things. Essentially, there's an article I can read for you guys, but it's a bit sciency, and I will probably link it in the low bar or in the Patreon post, which of course all of our
Well, I can talk
podcasts are
about the
free.
anti-aging thing. The reason why it's anti-aging, which I mean, yeah,
Well, it increases autophagy, but how?
well, how that's like there's just signaling that
Right.
how is not important. I think what's important is why is autophagy valuable,
Right. There seems to
and
be
what is autophagy?
telomerase
Okay,
signaling and autophagy. So if we could
so
talk about that,
yeah,
let's do that.
there's autophagy, and I think also apoptosis as well. That they usually associate it with autophagy. So autophagy is when basically your cells, as they are working, they tend to set up. Think of it like every cell is like a computer, and you know how you when you're installing various things, you end up with all the toolbars, and just eventually your computer just becomes crap because of all of the various things that are installed in it. This is basically specialization. So specialization for particular circumstances to take advantage of certain types of food sources, certain balances of chemicals, etc. A cell will tend to specialize. But in that specialization, you're basically creating kind of a pathway or like a ball of foil. It's like it's stacking a bunch of things together that are very specialized, and dependencies are created within that stack of systems. And then the more it's specialized and the more dependencies you create, the more that cell it becomes incapable of functioning properly under a wide variety of circumstances. So it's basically in your body, every organism on both the tiny scale and at a very large scale has to have this balancing act between adaptation and specialization. If you're very adaptive and you go to a lot of different circumstances, you're not very good and focused on one specific type of food source or one specific sort of niche that is really the only thing that's available to you. You're just kind of a generalist, and being a generalist in a new situation is extremely valuable. So there's always this balance all throughout nature of shifting back and forth across this line or trying to stick to one for a period of time, and it's just this going. This balance is you'll just find it everywhere. Is kind of my point. But with specifically with cells, the autophagy, what happens is it's basically reinstalling Windows. It's going and getting the cell back down to that more generalized state that can respecialize to different circumstances, and that basically makes the cell capable of reproducing better and not passing on defects and a variety of things like that. So autophagy relates to um, uh, anti-senescence, anti-aging in that way. That it's basically it's a resetting. And one of the things I like to bring up all the time is that the only organism we know of that lives indefinitely, basically it's immortal, is the immortal jellyfish. How does it do it? Well, it returns to innocence. Basically, what happens is they go back into a polyp state. They go back into
They
a
revert into an
generally
infant.
adaptive state. They revert
Yeah.
to infancy, basically. They despecialize. And once they despecialize, then because their environment is always changing, they can respecialize to the slightly different environment in which they will now be placed. And so that sort of thing that is the essence of what youth is. That is the essence of the reason why animals are programmed to die after a certain period of time, because that's what they are. They are programmed to die after a certain period of time. It's there in the length of our telomeres and things of that nature. It has to do with how long will a specialized individual be capable of working in an environment that is changing. And so it is a measure of how long, like for a specific, like for a fly or for something that has a short um, lifespan, its environment, which has to do with how far it can travel, et cetera, is going to be changing very rapidly. So it's best that it pass on its genes very rapidly and die and not take up resources. And so basically, it is if you look at this from like a Dawkins kind of selfish gene perspective, it is basically attempting to maximize the adaptation cycle between specialization and adaptation to what best fits for that specific animal. And so that's why we have death programmed in, and that's why we have babies. And then, you need the older ones to die off so that the newer version, the version 2.0, 3.0, et
Mhm.
cetera, can actually flourish without, in the new environment. So that's what the genes are doing. And so basically, by mimicking that process that is all throughout nature, what you're doing is you're creating the situation that genes are always attempting to um, that all of these very complex systems that are expressed through genes, basically the complex systems of life, which are basically eternal existence of an organism or life itself, etc. That's the solution to it, is going back and forth between the specialization and generalization. And so that's why it relates to anti-senescence, is basically you are at a small scale causing that reversion to a generalist state and removing specialization. So, and then also, of course, there is not just autophagy, which is the removal of subsystems in the cell. There's also apoptosis, where basically you're getting rid of cells that have reached a point at which they can no longer properly reproduce without passing along, problems and mutations and things of that nature. So that you do both of those things. Basically, your immune system goes in and starts tearing out all the junk, and using up basically, when it's time to say, okay, why would your body be saving all these things in the first place? Well, it's just like, let's look at what's happening in a rainforest. A rainforest there's a tremendous amount of diversity when you compare a rainforest versus a desert. the reason why you have diversity is because who knows what's going to happen in the future. So
Mm-hmm.
life itself is trying to create as many different possible models that might fit in billions of unknown niches that could be there in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason why nature tries to hang on to these very extremely diversified systems that is for the purpose of adaptation. But when the rubber meets the road and suddenly resources are low, it's time to pull out all the anything that is not absolutely necessary. You start cutting off all those exploratory attempts, which is that's what all the various species are. They're exploratory attempts. And so so the same thing, of course, happens in the body. Is you're all of the things that were exploratory attempts to specialize to the specific environment of your body, the foods that you eat, the fat and sugar balances, the hormone balances, you name it. All of those things are those cells are trying to specialize to that. But when you have to survive, you need additional fuel. Then all of those various things that are not very generalized and capable of working extremely well at their specific job, all of those things needed to be taken out. And so your body, of course, has developed that same system, which happens in nature, which is when a rainforest gets chopped down, then only the species that can survive in the new environment are the ones that move forward.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, the a lot of this essentially, if we talk about anti-aging and immortality or fountain of youth, things like that, those who are in the know will talk about telomerase and the lengthening of telomeres, which is the end caps of our DNA strands that have been shown with reduction of the telomeres, so does aging and damage accumulate in the body as well. And the longer the telomeres are, the more it seems the body is capable of regaining or restating back to a youthful, coming back to a youthful state. But of course, we don't have telomere therapy currently. That's not really a common thing. It's really hard to find. And so the a person here wrote an article on Medium, PD Mangan. He wrote 6 books on health and fitness and things like that. Not sure who he is, but it's a decent article. So
You look at the low bar.
yeah, I will link it in the low bar, and not just the low bar. Actually, there's 0 links in the low bar about the specific articles, but there is a link to Patreon because that is the hub of our CherrySTEM. You go to patreon.com/AnnaCherry. There's a CherrySTEM hashtag. Click on that. Every single episode is available to download in audio format for free, and it has all the supplementary readings and everything in that post. So follow, bookmark, do what you got to do on Patreon. You can actually follow them. There's also an RSS link to our podcast down below. But if you're looking for supplemental reading, that is all on patreon.com/AnnaCherry. Now, the idea here is that until telomere therapy comes along, intermittent fasting might be the best way of clearing damage. If aging, as Dr. P.D. Mangan argues, if aging is accumulation of damage, then clearing out said damage through autophagy seems to be the way to reduce aging. Now, there was an interview with Dr. Michael Fossel, who essentially talks about telomerase and telomere therapy being the one and only way to stop aging, and there seems to be a disagreement between these two people whether or not intermittent fasting is the next best way of clearing aging. But of course, Dr. Fossel, who disagrees with intermittent fasting being useful, is wrong. He's wrong. Sorry, we have
Yeah,
proof.
there's massive evidence.
Yeah, there's massive evidence that intermittent fasting helps with de-aging, and it also helps with a lot of other things, as I mentioned, such as fat loss and other things, and a lot of it actually has to do with insulin. So, if
But what did you read here? And because is there
no,
an
gotcha.
interplay between the lengthening of telomeres and because that's the one thing that basically the simplistic view of telomeres is there are these end caps that the machinery of DNA as a cell's replicating goes through and chops off one of these little end caps. And so the longer your telomeres are, the more times that cell can replicate. And then once it runs out of telomeres, then it just starts cutting off data and reading. Basically you're reading from a computer standpoint. You're like reading into memory. You're like into other memory. You're not. You're no longer the code itself is starting to fall apart, and and the mechanisms which read the code and execute it are basically failing, and because of the fact that there's no longer the parts of the system that basically count down, aren't there. And so I know telomerase lengthens telomeres, and so if you have telomerase, working efficiently, the amount of losses will, of course, be balanced by the number of those end caps that you gain, and so therefore it becomes a system that is self-sustaining and doesn't keep counting down. So the question, I guess, is then what is the interplay here? Because this is something where you did the research, and I'm just relying on old information that I
Yeah.
have in my head. And that's one of the parts that I haven't really looked into, is where the telomere lengthening portion of it comes in with respect to fasting.
As far as I have looked into it, which was just now, there doesn't seem to be any any studies, any published studies of any specific scientific documents that indicate there's a relationship between specifically telomerase and fasting.
What about
However,
autophagy and telomerase?
there is a study on PubMed that shows that multivitamin use in women is associated with longer telomeres.
Yeah, well, I know that what's it called? My family is fucked up in their ability to absorb folic acid. So folic acid, I know, is directly related to the production of telomerase. Um, Reduces telomerase. Huh.
Well, I don't
Well,
know what
one of the
HeLa
things
cells are,
is
but
the okay. Well, yeah, actually, that makes sense. So she's we're kind of signaling each other about, and that sounds weird. Is that we're looking at an article that says autophagy induction reduces telomerase activity. So that would be exactly the opposite, it seems. However, one
yeah,
of
it's
the things that
published in Mechanisms of Aging and Development in
Mhm.
April 2017.
Well, one of the things that you'll find all throughout the body is that it's always the after effect that is important. So you always want to induce the body to do things, and one of the things that every researcher in anti-aging, through the use of either fasting or fasting mimicking, or etc. One of the things that they always say is it is not the fasting itself that does the work; it is the refeeding. They
Mm-hmm.
say that where they see the benefits is not during the fasting. That's basically a stressor, and it is the after effect of it that you end up seeing the benefits. So it actually makes perfect sense that a reduction in telomerase production would then lead your body to detect this lowered amount, and then there would be a boomerang effect, and it would then increase afterwards. So that makes perfect sense with the story as we know it so far.
Found an article on PLOS One by an Asian team talking about hexokinase 2, and they're going in the other direction. That recent studies report, in the abstract anyway, they're mentioning that recent studies reported that telomerase and hexokinase 2 regulate autophagy through mTOR, and that telomerase has the capacity to bind to the AHK2 promoter. So telomerase, there seems to be a connection between autophagy and telomerase through the hexokinase HK2, hexokinase 2 binding.
Yeah.
It goes both ways.
Well, I mean that would probably be the cascade of effects that would lead, between that's probably the detection and compensation effect, which always happens in all throughout our body. Everything, all the cells, every system is a homeostatic system. In other words, it's always attempting, the way that something adapts is by a pressure on each side of a middle area that it should be shifting back and forth across to basically create an emergent effect that is based upon the local environment. And that's
That's the
how
one.
biology works, is through this sort of induction of emergence, and that way that's how adaptation is kind of induced. And so yeah, it makes perfect sense that they're whenever something goes to one side of the balance in a homeostatic system, the homeostatic system then always is tries harder to correct. That's why it's whenever, yeah, go ahead. You were going to say something.
Yes, that's bringing us further afield.
All right.
But I just wanted to, because I found it, I had it.
Okay, go
I
ahead.
was
Go do
excited.
it. Do it. It's all you.
Thank you. No, straight up in this article, which is on PLOS One. I will be linking it as well in the Patreon post. Telomerase deficiency impairs glucose metabolism and autophagy. So we know that clearly. Telomerase to autophagy, like having good
What?
telomere.
Say it again.
Telomerase deficiency impairs glucose metabolism and autophagy. So having
Okay.
crappy telomerase impairs your ability to clear out damage, which
Right.
makes sense. That's how you age. That's
Right.
part of this whole
Okay.
thing. Messed up telomeres equals lack of autophagy, etc. Next thing, linked, referenced. In addition, caloric restriction increases telomerase activity and enhances autophagy. There it fucking
Yeah,
is.
and so
Boom,
the
bang,
problem is
boom.
that a lot of times why you would have two studies that seem to be in conflict with
Hmm.
each other is they very frequently do not point out the time
Right, they
periods,
look at
and
before
they
versus after
and a lot of
versus.
times they'll just say what the effect is without pointing out that okay, this is during the treatment, this is after the treatment, and so they won't. In many studies, they have this problem, and the researchers themselves, for some reason, have not been taught to properly point out the differences between like what the effects of something that's chronic versus something that's acute, or all of these things that have to do with time based effects. In other words, if something like if you have acute administration of a specific chemical, there are effects during its activity, and then there are effects afterwards that are, of course, the system bouncing away from whatever it was that you just did. And that is something that is very well known by somebody who is in biology, but a lot of the researchers, I think they've become so specialized that they're not only not pointing it out. You can see in some of the papers that I've been reading through that they don't really necessarily get this principle, which was, it should be obvious. It should be like it's there everywhere. I mean, any kind of well-rounded look at all of these systems shows that they all conform to this system of rebound from homeostasis. That all of them have to do with these loops, these cascades of events that come back to the origin. And so I don't understand
Well,
why that's
also
not.
also a note on titles of studies versus what they actually say in them. Because the title of this article or study is autophagy induction reduces telomerase activity in HeLa cells. However, when you actually read it, they're talking about the fact that it is expression of a very overexpression of a specific signaling molecule called Beclin-1 that reduces telomerase activity by about 100-fold. So it is a very specific, and essentially their bottom line is that understanding the role of autophagy induction in telomerase can help with preventative and intervention and therapeutic strategies. So essentially, they're just looking into it and seeing that certain signaling molecules mess up telomerase and autophagy, but doesn't necessarily mean that autophagy messes up telomerase,
Yeah,
Even
and
though it
it's
seems like that's the
and so going
title
back to the metaphor
makes
of
it seem
like
like.
setting up a machine, you can end up having on a on your Windows machine, you got all these programs set up, and they end up interfering with each other in ways that wasn't intentional,
Exactly.
because it's such a complex system. And then the other thing that's important is that after you nuke your system to the ground, you have to reinstall the programs that you're going to use, or the system's useless. And so
Hmm.
that's part of the reason why it is that it's not just the fasting, it is also the refeeding. So one of the things I think that is very important is whenever a person does do fasting, that they don't refeed with shitty foods.
Mm.
Because so a lot of people are like, oh, I've done so good, with this fasting that now I could just eat a bunch of shit. Well, keep in mind the good that is done by the fasting is the after effect. So you should be especially eating the most healthy, the good
Most
fats that help you,
vitamin
yeah,
full.
vitamins,
As was shown, multivitamin use and telomere length in women. That's
yeah, that's
the.
almost certainly folic acid. So probably increase the intake of folic acid immediately thereafter would be one of the ways in which you want to potentiate the effect that's going to
And you can
occur
take that through
during refeeding.
herbs or through foods that contain folic acid, which I believe are usually greens, but I could be wrong on that. The other thing too is, yeah, leafy greens contain folic acid. Leafy greens such as spinach, citrus fruits, beans, and things like that. So get you some green beans, some spinach, some citrus fruits, some healthy cereals, multigrain kind of stuff, and some sprouted breads, and that will be some really good healthy but also carb loaded goodies. So you get you some citrus juice, that you get your sugar, get you some sprouted breads, that way you get the carbs and the comfort of the bread, with butter, because fats are great, grass-fed butter especially. Get you some of that, but when it's sprouted bread, it's essentially more, it's healthier than otherwise, than dead bread. A green spinach, etc. So that would be a really good refeeding strategy. Another thing too I did find is that an article in Molecular and Cellular, or a study published in 2015 in Molecular and Cellular Biochemistry, which essentially is titled "Calorie Restriction Increases Telomerase Activity, Enhances Autophagy, and Improves Diastolic Dysfunction in Diabetic Rat Hearts." So
So yeah, there's a lot when it comes to resetting the way your insulin production
that's
works.
what I was going to talk about
There's fatty liver
next.
diseases. You end up having all these fats, etc., in the liver itself, and so those are some of the first things that are kind of taken out that end up getting making your liver function better, which then, of course, that's a positive feedback loop. There's negative feedback loops where things get worse and make other things get worse, and then there's positive feedback loops where making things better make other things better, and that's one of the things that can happen with the liver health. Is that I'm pretty sure that that's part of the what happens with fasting is that there's an increase in liver health, and that leads to better insulin sensitivity, etc., which then of course would lead to better liver health.
Well,
So
let's look at what lower insulin even means, because you guys have heard insulin, you've heard diabetes. Like, diabetes is a problem. People get diagnosed with it. They just suddenly come down with diabetes out of nowhere, nowadays. So it's like, what is all that? What is diabetes? What is insulin? What is going on? How does any of that have to do with being fat? What is happening? Well, there's a number of psychological, sorry, physiological. Sorry. There are a number of misread that. Number of physiological mechanisms involved. Essentially, lower insulin reduces inflammation and oxidative stress, which leads to a greater number and quality of mitochondria, which helps with your energy, which also increases autophagy. Low insulin does, which is, this, as we've mentioned, the cellular self-cleaning process. Now, there's a lot of beneficial effects that are entwined in low insulin. So, function of insulin is to promote energy storage and the growth of an organism. So, therefore, insulin dysregulation. I believe insulin is a hormone.
yeah,
So, hormones are extremely effective. They change your body in massive ways. Let's just look
yeah.
at
There's a lot of
testosterone
DNA
and estrogen.
signaling that happens
Hmm.
where mRNA signals and things of that nature are strongly influenced by hormonal factors.
Right. So we talk about neurochemicals, and that's great and all, but to me, hormones are actually perhaps greater, and of course they influence neurochemicals. But hormones to me are upstream of neurochemicals. Hormones affect DNA signaling, which essentially tells your body what to do. That's what DNA signaling is. It tells your body to reproduce particular cells, to go over certain areas of the DNA and do what those areas say. And we've talked about briefly epigenetics and things like that, which we'll do a greater article or a greater topic on at some point. But essentially, the way you live your life and the food that you take and the environment that you live in actually changes what your DNA expresses. So we have a variety of abilities and adaptations in our DNA. The same human can survive in a desert versus a jungle, while feeding conditions and living conditions are vastly different in those two places. But we have that ability in us because of the histones, which is little coiled up areas that wrap up DNA on them, and they move, they unroll based on environmental factors, and diet, and otherwise, and emotional factors as well. It is quite literally possible to think yourself like to be sad to death. Like it is quite likely, and maybe even scientifically proven that people can think themselves to death when they're, sad. They essentially, their hearts stop because they're just too fucking depressed.
It's basically it's a break. The hormonal signaling of stress leads
Mm-hmm.
to various types of inflammation, which then becomes a feedback loop, which then modulates the immune
Breaks your
system,
system.
and which makes more inflammation. And so what you're talking about is a cascading set of effects from depression because of the ways in which your brain can alter hormone expression to the point at which there is a mind body connection that is very mechanical, that you can, that's not, we're not talking about something that's like in any way magical. It's
Right.
directly, easily traceable to mechanics of hormones and systems and cascades of and therefore downward
Mm-hmm.
spiraling loops that in the way that these systems work until the whole system collapses. And so that's what we're talking about
Right.
there.
Exactly. It's not just some mystical woo woo like you think yourself to death, but it is a mind body connection is very, very real. Your mind is what your brain does, and your brain controls everything your body does. And so let's look at testosterone and estrogen. I mean, there's a reason why whenever people transition from one gender to another, they take hormones, and that changes the way they look in a massive way, specifically female to male. And of course, we know about athletes and just men. Maybe some of you have taken steroids or artificial testosterone or whatever, where you can see some of the greatest effects on your body, like literal physical body changes. Antidepressants don't do that. Little psychedelics don't do that. Any kind of psychoactive component doesn't do that. So neurochemicals is great and all. It affects your mood, it affects your personality, sure, but not like hormones. Hormones affect your whole body. They affect your phenotype, how you look, how your body expresses itself.
And incidentally, oxytocin is both a neurochemical and a hormone.
Oxytocin is a big one. Insulin also. So you've heard insulin. People do insulin shots when they are diabetic, this and that. What is all
Doing
this?
shots.
Doing shots. So many beneficial effects are entwined with specifically lower insulin levels. And as I was saying, the function of insulin is to promote energy storage and the growth of organisms. Energy storage because it has to do with mitochondria activity, and growth of organism. That's how people grow. Maybe in the direction they don't want to,
And
but
let's talk about why is it important that lower insulin level. So why would you have a
right.
lower insulin level? You have a lower insulin level when you have less food, because insulin is converting um, energy sources into energy, and that's one of the pathways in which it's a conversion factor. And
Right.
so during fasting and during reduced food intake, you would have lower insulin.
Mm-hmm.
And incidentally, let's also mention that one of the things that one of the first ways in which they started to get on this path of recognizing that lower food intake can lead to anti-senescent effects is because back in like early
Senescence is aging.
right back in like 2000 era, they started discovering that food reduction in animals, just reducing their food intake, would massively
About
increase
30%
their
lifespan
lifespan. And
increase
so that's part of how they started down this path of figuring out what's going on,
with fasting.
how it
Yeah.
is that we're capable of living longer just from reduction of food. And so part of the picture, of course, is insulin.
Right. And what happens when you eat, etc., insulin is increased, fat is stored in fat cells, and other cells take up glucose from the blood. And most importantly, when insulin is increased, lipids can't leave fat cells. So, since fat cell loss is about getting lipids out of fat cells to be burned up for energy, losing fat requires some attention to how diet, exercise, and fasting can cause insulin to rise and fall. So essentially, the fat loss aspect of it is lipids, fats, leaving those fat cells to be used for energy. And insulin, when it's increased, it doesn't let that fat leave, it stays.
And
So,
so that's the basically insulin's part of the energy storage,
mhm.
converting foods and energy sources to a storage state, whereas the other state is the ketone system, and the ketone system is all about taking the energy that's in fat, etc., and making it available to cells. And so there's two different ways. You can have your sugars that are readily available in your blood directly from your food, and that's and glucose and a number of other energy sources directly from food. But then there's also the ketone energy
Hmm.
pathway, and so you have these two major energy pathways that can be switched from one to the other, and that happens during
Through insulin.
fasting. It takes that switch from one to the other.
Yeah. But yeah, essentially that's where intermittent fasting comes in, because if you have lower levels of insulin, you have higher lipolysis, getting rid of that fat. So eating causes insulin to rise, but the amount that rises is dependent on a variety of factors, such as the type of food, the amount, etc. For instance, there's actually evidence to suggest that eating low salt, having a low sodium diet, increases your insulin. Not good. So,
Not
uh,
cool, bro.
high sugar, low salt diets are actually messing up insulin like crazy in people. And there's evidence to suggest that, and I will try to link it in the post. There's a great video by What I Learned on the relationship of salt and fat through insulin and the liver and all of that good stuff. Or kidneys or all of it. It's all great. Great article, great video. I'll link that.
You might want to put a reminder up by because you might forget that one since you don't have a link up anywhere.
All right. Yeah, it takes an entire video to go into the different ways in which salt, for instance, has to do with insulin, which you wouldn't think that those are to even be related, but they actually are. But it takes, a 15-minute video to just explain all of that by somebody who,
Yeah, you did a great job.
yeah, created
I
it.
really
So
enjoyed his stuff.
yeah, we need to keep watching it.
Yeah,
But
cool.
yeah, so essentially, what you eat affects how much insulin is excreted, but just eating alone causes insulin to rise. So the longer, hence intermittent fasting, the longer you can wait. It's not about what you eat; it's when you eat. The longer you can wait before eating, the more time you spend in low insulin state, high lipolysis state. So high amounts of carbohydrates and low insulin sensitivity cause a greater rise in insulin, and that's what diabetes is. You have insulin insensitivity. People become completely insensitive to it. And one of the ways you can help that sensitivity or insensitivity, because you have both, you end up having two types of diabetes actually, based on how sensitive or insensitive they are to insulin. And stevia supplementation actually helps with that. So if you're looking for a sweetener substitute, or something to help you with your
It's
insulin.
a natural herb basically, and
It's a grass that grows
you can actually use it in high amounts as a therapeutic.
Supplement.
Yeah, as a therapeutic supplement. So, was there a connection between um, the process of autophagy and insulin that you were
That's
laying out?
yes, I am.
Specifically when
I'm
it comes to
leading up to it.
telomerase.
Not no.
Okay,
Forget about
just
telomerase. That's too
okay. Yeah, too deep.
too esoteric.
Okay.
Way too deep. But we're already getting pretty deep with this insulin stuff. But so essentially, insulin increases when you eat. Insulin increases and stays higher for several hours after eating. That is during the fed state. And so the absence of food during intermittent fasting is what lowers your insulin. So, why should you care about that? Why does that matter? Well, we mentioned what it has to do with fat loss, for instance. Um, Now there's some sweet spot for intermittent fasting. It's a 16 to 8 ratio, and I'll talk about that. But essentially, fasting, as we were saying, also promotes autophagy. The great benefits of intermittent fasting is the cellular inducing the cellular self-cleaning process that breaks down and recycles damaged molecules and organelles. And so during this fed state, when insulin is increased, the rate of autophagy is low. During the fasted state, as insulin drops, autophagy increases dramatically, perhaps even fivefold. So many of the anti-aging effects of calorie restriction and intermittent fasting, like we were saying, there were studies on rats where they showed them living 30% longer from just a reduction in how much food they eat. So many anti-aging effects of calorie restriction and intermittent fasting come from this increase in autophagy. There's actually a book discussing this relationship between intermittent fasting, therefore insulin levels, low insulin, and autophagy, called Stop the Clock, the Optimal Anti-Aging Strategy. And I will be linking that as well. So a high rate of autophagy is a characteristic of young organisms. With aging, autophagy decreases, and that's what allows cellular damage to accumulate.
So basically, you're saying that young organisms are more generalized and older organisms are more specialized.
Yep.
Huh, what do you
Uh-huh.
know?
Uh-huh. So by fasting intermittently, autophagy rates can be reset to that of a younger person. So essentially fountain of youth. And as we've seen, one of the ways that happens is through lowered insulin. So exercise, for instance, improves insulin sensitivity. So for any given fasting stimulus, a person who is in shape will see insulin levels drop and lipolysis commence faster than someone who is not in shape. So it, of course, diet and exercise. And by diet, we mean like don't fucking eat, like literally don't eat,
Well,
and
also
exercise.
eat the right
Eat
things,
the
yeah,
right
of
things
course.
for sure. But yeah, there's an optimal sweet spot for intermittent fasting, and I will talk about that after I finish outlining the health benefits in detail. Low carb diets cause less of a rise in insulin. So a low carb diet, a person will also see their intermittent fasting benefits and autophagy happen faster than someone who eats poorly and doesn't exercise. So healthy diet and exercise will lead you to have faster results in anti-aging. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it if you're out of shape and don't eat the right things. It still helps a lot. Now
And
autophagy.
there's good
Mhm.
reason to believe that basically what you're talking about there is ketosis,
Yes.
which we like since the time of Atkins diet, people have been talking about ketosis and things like that. But there's good reason to believe that the ketosis is not the strange other state, but it is the primary state that organisms are normally in, and it is this other state that we get into that has to do with this constant use of insulin and constant presence of insulin because we have so much abundance. That's the abnormal state. That's not really not as normal for a healthy, active animal in the wild, for instance.
Yeah, the interesting thing about it too is, since we're talking about autophagy and insulin, the relationship between those two, autophagy is suppressed in the presence of insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. That's one of the main mechanisms behind the deleterious effects of diabetes and obesity. Because as you who have friends or family who have diabetes, you may know people lose limbs to diabetes. So it literally ravages your body, and
In a variety
in a
of
variety of
ways.
ways. And this is a
And the
direct
rate,
link to autophagy. But your gangrenous body parts and autophagy seem to be completely linked hand in hand.
that's a bit.
Clearing
There's a
out
lot of
damage.
steps in between,
Yeah.
right?
Well, it just seems like if you have a healthy autophagy that is clearing out all the damage, that is continuing to repair cells, that is signaling as a young, healthy
Oh,
body would signal, then you wouldn't necessarily have as many.
well, you wouldn't have the problems with circulation that
Right,
occur, and
right.
because the healthy cells basically what happens is you have these cells that are you have more and more
Damaged,
unhealthy
and yeah.
cells that are basically not functioning properly.
Yeah.
They're not as elastic, etc. This reduces the ability for circulation to occur, and then it leads to those things that end up in that what you're talking about with the limbs becoming gangrenous. That is a critical failure of a lot of different
Right.
systems. And so we're talking about two vastly different levels. And at the level of the autophagy, you're basically you're talking about each individual cell being capable of doing its job properly, whereas there is a specific cascade of events that leads to the large scale failures.
Right. It's just fascinating that specifically autophagy is so strongly linked to insulin, to where it is completely reduced down to practically nothing when you have insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia. So this is the things I mentioned, the two sides of insulin resistance or hypersensitivity. And both of those actually are regulated by stevia. You can use it as a supplement in your tea. It's not the perfect sugar substitute, but it's great for cooking, adding it to stuff.
I think the science on using it as a supplement, you actually have to like take pills because of
Right. You have to take
the
massive
amount you
amounts.
have to take is pretty large. But still,
Stevia is
hey,
usually concentrated anyway,
just
so
small amounts of it are probably helpful too. So
exactly. Exactly. So, what is the sweet spot for intermittent fasting? Well, we have some evidence here that the most common intermittent fasting schedule. So essentially, what are we talking about? Intermittent fasting, what you do is how it works. You condense all of your eating into a set period of time and then fast for the rest of the day, or fast for the beginning of the day, which is what tends to be the most common one. So the window in which
Really?
you eat is the window in which you eat might be way more important than what you eat. And so once again, it's when you eat, not what you eat. The most common intermittent fasting schedule is 16 to 8, which is 16 hours not eating and 8 hours of eating. So quote here is, it is quite possibly the most popular eating schedule in the intermittent fasting world. It allows for 8-hour eating window, usually starting with a late lunch and dinner. Skipping breakfast is easier for most because lunch and dinner seem to be the most social times for meeting up and eating together.
Ah,
And for
makes
us,
sense.
so yeah, that's another thing. When you're losing weight, or when you're trying to be a vegetarian or what have you, the biggest difficulty is going out with your friends to eat. The social aspect of eating. Once again, we've talked about this. The biggest thing you spend your money on is entertainment. We could eat gruel by ourselves and or eat Soylent blocks by ourselves and get our necessary nutrition. Why do we get together around meals that are fancy and bountiful and in beautiful locations with our friends? Why? Entertainment. It is a social connection. It is something extra to it that ends up being very difficult to pull away from, and it ends up holding you back if you're trying to change and those people
And
around you
then
don't.
when you realize that you associate eating and meals with a happy time with
Mm-hmm.
people,
Mm-hmm.
and then when you're feeling shitty, what do? You eat. Well, that's because
Yep.
there's an association, and so you're hitting not just the dopamine of eating itself, but the dopamine also associated with social or
Bonding.
positive events that you know have as well. So there's multiple ways in which your brain is giving you reward, and that's why you'll seek food during times of that you're not feeling good.
Exactly. Exactly right. So the gluttonous aspect that we were talking about in
So,
the beginning.
did you are any of the articles that you're covering going to talk about how fasting alters your biome? Because that also was a an important thing that had
Not
come up.
directly, no.
Oh, well, that's too bad. Well, maybe we can do a little more research on that and mention it in another podcast. But I know that one of the things that is important is that you're okay. So we've talked about how the biome can really your microbiome can really alter
Mm-hmm.
the way in which you think, the way your emotional state is directly linked to your microbiome because
Right.
of all the various vitamins and there's a lot of different ways in which it does this. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's changes to the guts, thickness and the and how its permeability and just a vast number of things, and then that let's talk about how the gut can actually through vitamin D. One of the things that they've found, well, actually, yeah, somebody we're related to specifically found that vitamin D alters the gut's production of serotonin. So you have the serotonin and mu-opioid balance in the gut and also in the brain, and the way that it works in the gut versus the brain are basically opposites, and it depends on what signaling is given to the cells in those areas, whether they respond in the way they're supposed to or not. And basically, autism is related to this flipping of the signaling so that it's not using the balance of serotonin and mu opioids properly. And so part of that, of course, is the what bacteria are present, what kind of environment those bacteria are creating for the cells that are there, and all of these things are linked together. There are all of these vast number of causal effects that come into that they come together, they aggregate. It's not you don't look at it from this leads to this leads to this. It's tons of things are create an overarching environment that is a combination of effects. And so changing your microbiome in your gut, of course, that's the way in which it is altering your mental state is through these sorts of balances, because there is a signaling between the gut and the brain that kind of links them. And I know I'm getting a little general here, but it is still an area of active research, and it's a very interesting connection between the two. But obviously, the fact that fasting leads to change in your microbiome, and you end up seeing that a lot of people find that there is well, one of the ways that, going back to the spirituality thing, people find that the ways that they cast out demons. I mean, what were demons? People's mental disabilities. Basically, people,
Disorders.
whenever somebody was going through schizophrenia, which can be fucking horrible for a person. Fasting is one of the ways in which basically they would cast out the demons, and which means basically
Starve
restoring.
the body of the
Right,
demon.
right. Changing their gut microbiome is what they were doing, and so when you go and you limit the type of, well, first off, you just limit the food that is available to your gut. Then a lot of the weed-like microbes, like yeast in particular, loves sugar, and it also likes an alkaline environment. And so when you have a sugary alkaline environment, then you end up creating an overage of these weeds, and then the more deeply rooted is the best way to continue with the analogy here. The most deeply rooted types of bacteria that may be slower acting. So if we think of this as like like your lawn, you have the Bermuda grass that has the deep roots, but it can be overcome by too many weeds that grow fast and use up resources. But if those deeper rooted, slower growing grasses come in thickly enough, they block out the weeds, and so there's this sort of thing that can happen, of course, in your gut as well. And so when you're cutting off those quick sources of energy, etc., the types of bacteria that are beneficial happen to be the ones that are capable of lasting through the fasting period, and because they're more deeply rooted in a certain way. In other words, they can go into a better hibernating state because they're not locust like. They're not they don't feast on
Feed on
the
trash.
quick energy sorts of things.
Right.
Their systems of energy use are more long term, basically.
Well, the neat thing too is there's a science translational medicine article paper about intermittent fasting helps reduce diabetes associated right now. Well, point is, fasting the microbiome treats diabetes. It doesn't really matter the details that they go into, but they essentially change the microbiome and the bile acid metabolism through fasting, and it actually helps treat diabetes, as well as the fact that gut bacteria. There is a great Medium article on why your gut microbes love intermittent fasting, and I will link that as well in the Patreon post for this. Why do gut microbes? What do like you have circadian rhythms in your body, right? Well, believe it or not, gut microbes also have a circadian rhythm. So you can actually, by doing intermittent fasting, you can not only disrupt or change your own clock, but you can change their clock too, and that can certainly change things as well, in terms of what bacteria stays and what bacteria goes. Some bacteria, for instance, Enterobacter aerogenes is sensitive to melatonin. So, a variety of things that you do that change your circadian rhythm can change what happens in your body, and so
Wow.
timing
That
and
is
yeah,
that is like I'm rereading
timing
this
and
quote
eating.
here. Disruption of the microbiome circadian rhythm is associated with metabolic disease in mice, and host immune cells have been shown to respond to the resident microbiota in a circadian fashion. That is fucking unreal.
Yeah.
That's so cool. And also, not good for how we are not properly, keeping up with a circadian rhythm. That's we need to do a little more to make sure that we've got a good rhythm, because it's obviously very important to your
Yep.
health.
Yeah, research suggests that following a normal feeding rhythm, whatever that, even if you're jet lag, for instance, can help restore healthy rhythms in your gut. So there's all sorts of rhythms are involved, and once you get into a good intermittent fasting um, rhythm and stick with it, that will be the best for everything. But fasting and microbes, this article is really, really long. But essentially, 2014 study found that intermittent fasting helped salmonella infected mice to clear the pathogenic bacteria more quickly through a heightened immune response. So intermittent fasting not only helping the insulin and a variety of other things, low insulin and the health benefits that come from that, like autophagy, it also helps with your immune system. We did talk about intermittent fasting and low insulin specifically, lowering inflammation. So that's one of the ways in which you can do that. I'm assuming anyway that that's the mechanism of this intermittent fasting, alternate day fasting for 12 weeks. Helped salmonella infected mice clear the pathogen bacteria more quickly. So their immune system was better. A 2017 study found that alternate day fasting in mice led to elevated gut microbe fermentation products, acetate and lactate, which in turn promote white adipose tissue browning. Now, white fat and brown fat, what and bat. There's another great what I learned video about that. Essentially, you have two types of fat in your body. One is white fat, the other one is brown fat. White fat is what makes you fat. Brown fat is what can be used for energy. So the fact that acetate and lactate, which had to do with, so we're talking about here alternate day fasting, led to elevated gut microbe fermentation product. So fermented things are great, by the way. Get you some kimchi, get you some kombucha, some sauerkraut. That stuff is amazing for your gut bacteria. Now, elevated gut microbe fermentation products, acetate and lactate, in turn promote white adipose tissue browning. So you are literally taking these white fat cells that can't go anywhere and stay as fat, and you are turning them into, you're beiging them by turning them into usable fat, because brown fat contains higher number of mitochondria and is associated with greater insulin sensitivity and metabolic health in animals and humans. So that's what they call healthy fat, is brown fat. So there's just a variety of things in which intermittent fasting and
It's
gut
funny that
microbes.
there's one of the things that my father raised cattle as one of his the things that he really liked, and one of the things that when they feed them corn, they end up with white fat, and they just like that because of the way that it looks. But it's always whenever my father was crazy about doing stuff with testing the animals and their cholesterol and the cholesterol types, and
Nice.
because he was one of the first people to create this health beef was his thing. And one of the things that they noticed is the difference between the type of fat that you have. The fat would be brown, and oh, that's not as pretty
Ew.
for cattle that are
Yeah,
that are that
marbled
are
with brown. Ugh.
that are grass fed versus this nice white, disgusting fat, basically
Mm-hmm.
for that's in you know
Regular meat. Yeah.
yeah, that's in the uh, feedlot cattle.
Right, right.
Cattle that are stressed and given a bunch of
Yeah, factory
corn that they're
farming.
not
Yeah.
basically factory farming. Yeah, so it's so funny how just basically it was people choosing form over function, and they still do that today. I mean, they still want that white fat instead of the brown fat that you get in cattle. And then the point I kind of forgot to get across here was that whenever he was testing his cattle, which were basically beefalo. They had in general, even when they were supplemented with grain, they still had more brown fat because they were a wilder type animal. Because of the bison genes that they had, and so there was, both the having the grass fed as well as, this other breed of animal made it where whenever he tested the meat in comparison, the levels of cholesterol were different, and a lot of different things like that were modulated by the practices that he was using. So it
Nice.
was neat.
We do have a question from one of our patrons in chat. So we're talking about Lent, which is a 40-day fast, but it goes for 46 days on the calendar because Sundays don't count. Is that type of an intermittent fasting? So if I'm understanding it correctly, what we're talking about here is not eating for 6 days and then eating on Sundays. I don't think that's classic intermittent fasting. I would call that, because traditionally intermittent fasting is either doing it for 16 to 8, so like condensing all of your feeding into the 8 hours, or going every other day, as we saw in the studies with a lot
I
of
mean,
these
some of it's
rats.
just fasting. I don't know anything about Lent.
I don't know anything about Lent either. I just tried to look it up, but they don't say anything about not eating. It's mostly just about when it's observed in different
Yeah, I thought that
Catholic
you gave
churches
up
or.
one particular thing, which seems that's somewhat irrelevant if you're,
Oh, you gave just one particular thing? Yeah,
right.
no.
Yeah, that doesn't really matter.
Right, because we're talking about all, or not, okay. Because yeah, I know some people like give up meat for Lent or give up chocolate for Lent, so that's maybe that's the more modern tradition. But okay, the idea is not eating for 6 days and then only eating on Sundays.
Yeah, that seems
Yeah,
like
that's
that's basically that's a
hardcore intermittent fasting.
right. That's a fast. It's not
It's
even
not even
intermittent.
intermittent, yeah.
It's fasting with tiny breaks to allow you to continue the fast for a long period of time. Is
Which
what it
is
sounds like.
great. Sounds
Yeah,
great.
so it does sound like it's a very healthy thing, and probably the reason why it's part of religion is that it does clear up your head. It probably does make you, and therefore when your head's
People say
clear,
that you actually
you
get
would
clear-headed when you're fasting after
right. Well,
first
and
five
then
days.
after the fact as well. And so
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
basically and then people would have more self-control
Willpower.
and they would be more, spiritually inclined. In other words, more basically less of an animal that's just foggy headed going after, various fatty, foods as well as other dopamine sources. Basically, you almost certainly would end up having more self-control and all those things that are associated with spirituality after a fast. So it's funny that they would
So it makes sense that
associate them.
monks would do that.
Yeah, exactly. It makes
Yeah.
perfect sense that they have noticed a real effect and are they may put different terminology on what's going on, but they're noticing something that is a real effect, and
Hmm.
that's why that they I think that's why they practice it. I mean, and all the other health benefits they have with it too. So basically, they see it as a spiritual practice that is healing the body when there is a very direct rational mechanical reasoning why it leads to healing the body
Yeah.
as well as the mind.
Yeah. And I would say that if we're talking about monks, that essentially not ordinary people, clarification, it was only monks that fasted for 40 days with Sunday breaks. And if I understand the monk culture correctly, their food is somewhat limited and regimented to certain types. So that takes care of the refeeding too. It's not like you fast for 6 days and then eat whatever the fuck you want on Sunday. On Sundays, you're refeeding yourself with good stuff,
They're
probably.
not going to Mickey D's and loading up on 12,
Trans fat burgers.
yeah, trans fat burgers. Right.
No, you're probably eating some grass from your own garden, some oatmeal or porridge or whatever that you grew yourself. I honestly don't know what monks eat. Um,
No clue. There's no
zero,
way to know.
no way to find out.
I
So,
got allow.
uh,
Kitty has showed up. He's ready. He's ready to participate now.
yes, he is. So yeah, essentially, intermittent fasting. The best way that it works in current society is for people is 16 to 8, and the way we do it personally is. So another thing too, I would want to mention is the ketosis or ketogenic aspect of it is that you need to replace carbs and sugars with fats. You need to start getting your source of energy from fats. So paleo diet, fucking go for it, man. Like, yeah, grass and fatty meats and dairy that is grass based, grass fed animal based, as low hormone as you can get it, as local, if you have a local farmer that produces dairy and meat, fucking go there. Otherwise, a plant based, high fat, yes, that's what
Yeah,
you
that's
need.
even better because a lot of times what you end up having if you're having animal proteins is you end up having animals that have been that are full of stress
Stressed all to
hormones.
hell, yeah.
They're fed shit diets, so
They're,
therefore things
yeah, they're
like their
fed,
fat is the wrong kind, and
right? They got white fat.
there's a variety of things that basically we fucked it all up, and
Hmm.
so it doesn't work very well. But I mean, if you
Well, because the objective isn't to create healthy food, it's to create the most for least amount of money.
right, exactly. It's always the profit motive that
All
fucking
right.
everything up.
Should be
So
health motive instead, but who's going to pay for that?
who's gonna fund that project?
Well, if we had more interconnectivity in our society between things like health, insurance, and feeding, because it's all connected, then I think people would find ways to pay for that because healthier people are more productive.
Well, the point is, it's if we're gonna say something bad about the idea of market, etc., it's because most of the time people will choose short-term solutions over long-term solutions, and short-term solutions actually sabotage long-term effects, whereas long-term effects are usually, when you go after them, they don't match the pursuit of short-term gains. And so there's this balance between short and long term, where sometimes you do have to deal with short-term things. You do have to make the short-term decisions and therefore fuck up the long-term things because that's your only choice. But that is the lesser choice. That is the and all throughout nature, it is the more long-term thinking, the more long-term planning that ends up making systems that work better. And unfortunately, the way in which market economics impact us is always short-term. What's this quarter? And so people just did that. That's part of the problem with very simplistic market ideas is that there is a value to market ideas and ideals that's very powerful and useful. However, there's also very powerful detriments that come whenever you're basically only focusing on short term gains and short term effects.
Right. The cool thing though about
And that's all we're going to say about that.
yeah, the cool thing about the what I was why I'm bringing up keto is because if you start fueling your body with fat instead of sugar, you actually don't have that, or carbs, you don't have that crash. You don't have that. I just ate Chinese buffet and I'm hungry 20 minutes later. It's a very interesting thing, but we've personally been experiencing it with something like bulletproof coffee, for instance, where, as I mentioned earlier, the most common fasting schedule is 16 to 8, so 16 hours not eating, and then condense all of your eating into 8 hours. And people usually start with late lunch and dinner. Skip breakfast. Breakfast is not the most important meal of the day, and we have personally experienced this, and that's the best way for us to do it as well. Where you take you add a little bit of MTC oil, which is coconut oil, medium chain triglycerides, and sometimes butter. Well, of course, Bulletproof Coffee has a whole recipe, but essentially you add just a little bit of high fat to your coffee. Lately, we've been preferring just heavy cream. And that alone, drinking a cup of coffee in the morning that it has a lot of fat in it, that's breakfast. Like I can push, and of course with practice, you can get better and better at pushing your window of not eating longer and longer and longer.
And the point is to stay in that ketogenic state,
Yes.
so that you're not so part of
So we just drink a
lengthening
cup
it.
of coffee and then that's it, and we don't eat for like 8 hours in the morning.
Yeah, and then basically that's a kind of a cheat to
Yeah.
that's kind of halfway between a true fast and being able to have some of the same effects, which are to stay in the ketogenic state that you have in fasting. You don't actually break that ketosis because you are only adding fats, and so that's part of why the whole bulletproof coffee thing, etc., can be useful, is because you're not breaking ketosis.
Right, but that also is contingent upon not overloading on carbs the rest of the time.
Yeah.
But intermittent fasting by itself can make a huge difference. So, the skipping breakfast, sometimes, you got to go to work, you feel like you're low energy, like what the fuck? Just add a little bit of extra fat in your coffee in the morning, or get a little smoothie or something with some MTC oil in it. Anything you can to sort of get that source of energy through fat, and that will actually help you push to late lunch and early dinner. It's kind of amazing how much that actually helps uh, push, and that leads me to the next thing. Well, two things. I wanted to joke that I have a joke bridge that says. Next time you're gonna go see family, you can just tell them that you're fasting, and so you can't you can't go over for you
Oh,
can't come
sorry.
over for dinner because
I can't come over. It's the middle of my fast. Do you want me to? Do you want me to age? Do you want me to be unhealthy? I got to keep my fast going here. I mean, I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do about it.
exactly. But there was something else of shoot, what did I just say?
Talking about excuses for
Right before that.
shit. I don't know. Galileo, help us out here.
Well, speaking of, a decade of data reveals that heavy multitaskers have reduced memory. And that's exactly what I'm doing right now. I'm multitasking like a motherfucker. There we go. Perfect. So, as I was saying, have a little something to help you push into your fast, intermittent fast. So help with pushing away that desire to eat. A little bit of fat in your coffee can go a long way with that. But there's things you can do yourself with your mind to help you push past discomfort, or to help you hang on into something that you're not enjoying for longer. So we're segueing now into family and fun part of it. So the fun part, I decided to add that for alliteration's sake, but essentially we're gonna go over some strategies to help you when you're feeling stuck, or in another way during this time in the winter through seasonal affective disorder. It's cold, you are not socializing with people as much. There's more temptations with unhealthy foods and a variety of distractions and things during this time of year that can really detract or be detrimental to our productivity, our mental health, our ability to, stay healthy and happy. And so, one of the strategies that I wanted to pass on to you and this will help with fasting specifically, but it will also help with other things. So it's called the five more rule, and it's sort of similar to that the principle that was it Mitsubishi owner, or there's one of the Japanese car company people, he pioneered this idea that if you do something for 1 minute every day, you start to build a habit of that over a long period of time. So that's one of the sort of life hacks. So how to build a new habit is just do it for 1 minute every day, and then you can increase that to 1 hour, etc. So this is sort of similar to that. It is called five more, just five more rule. So of course it's easy to get overwhelmed by all the things, especially right now. And especially now when you're having decreased willpower, you're more susceptible to temptations. You're less patient. There's more impulsivity. For instance, there's been studies found around Thanksgiving. For instance, Psychology Today posted an article that what you eat as your Thanksgiving tradition actually changes how you behave on Black Friday. Oddly enough, it's interesting that those two are bedfellows, because there's some people who have non-traditional Thanksgiving feasts, such as pizza, or Jewish people go out to Chinese restaurants to eat for Christmas. Like there's little traditions that people have for Thanksgiving and other holidays where they don't eat what is traditional. It's an alternate tradition, and they've looked at people who have alternate food traditions as opposed to classic turkey American traditions, and the serotonin, or the tryptophan, which is a precursor to serotonin in turkeys, actually makes people more impulsive and less patient. And so it essentially feeds right into that Black Friday madness. If you eat more traditional food, you have less self-control. So we're surrounded by things like that during holiday season. All of the turkeys are making us lose our mind. And so essentially what you do is, for this just five more, it is to help you regain the lost art of concentration. And concentration can help with so many other things, like patience, you can understand things better. Patience leads to other things, like you can have a better experience listening to people, you have a better experience understanding new information. There's just so much that a mental calm and patient outlook can help you achieve, and I believe a lot of that has to do with concentration. On some level, there's a connection, I believe. So this five more rule is very simple. It's a way to help you concentrate better. It goes like this: whenever you feel like quitting, just do five more minutes, five more exercises, five more pages, whatever, and it will extend your focus. And it's some people call it five to thrive, or it's cheesy, but it helps remember that just do five more of whatever. I personally actually do this with exercise, where I do one more. I set a particular limit of reps to myself, and then I always do an extra one. I don't know why, I just do. But I'm going to have to increase that to five now that I've read this. So yeah, essentially, we will be talking more about willpower in the after show, if our patrons are interested in that. I can talk about it on air instead, but let's just keep things short, because we're starting to get into our second hour now. And yeah, so just five more is another strategy. So we mentioned strategies to help with overeating in the beginning of the podcast, and now we kind of have another tip minute to help you out with other aspects that may be difficult during this holiday season, especially when dealing with family, or having to push past distractions and still get your work done. For a lot of people, this time of year is senioritis central, Not that there's necessarily a whole lot of work to be done, but sometimes, you may not want to be held back by the seasonal affective disorder and a variety of other things that are bringing you down. And a quick life hack to, in the moment, sort of bottom up, just to really quickly take care of that issue, help your concentration, help your patience, is just five more. And I've personally experienced that pushing past anxiety of wanting to quit. Oh, that's glorious. Oh, the dopamine that you get, the pleasure that you get once you push past anxiety and continue staying to your task is glorious. But how do you get there? So this five more is really a nifty little trick to help out with that. Now, I did mention that decade of data reveals that heavy multitaskers have reduced memory. So it's a Stanford psychologist. That's another thing too, is thankfulness, concentration. Like we're leading into the family and fun sort of side of the holiday aspect. So when you're at a meal with your family or friends, your adopted family, whoever you call your family, of course, it is common for people to have their phones out and to check up on it and things like that. But I would very much urge everyone, especially when you're in the family setting, especially for Christmas coming up, any kind of time period where you are meant to be spending time with loved ones, it could be a fun thing to institute a house rule where there's a bowl and everyone puts their phones into it. Just some sort of fun little gimmick of, like, like in kindergarten we used to do, break the ice by, introducing yourselves and saying one fact about yourself. Like getting people involved in a communal activity like that may be embarrassing or people may not want to participate in or whatever. Actually pulling them into it and getting them involved in it will be a very good bonding strategy. And if you especially do it for something like improving concentration and on each other, and on being thankful and on spending time with each other without distractions, that can actually help your memory, of all things. So there's been a paper co-authored with neuroscientist Melina Unkafer of University of California, San Francisco, summarized a decade's worth of research on the relationship between media multitasking and various domains of cognition, including working memory and attention. And in doing the analysis, Wagner noticed an emerging trend in the literature. People who frequently use many types of media at once, or heavy media multitaskers, perform significantly worse on simple memory tasks. So this isn't even about like using your devices to remember things for you. It is, I think, in my experience, or not even experience, in my learning and experience of knowing neuroscience and psychology, I would say that it once again has to do with concentration. That concentration and ability to expand your mental capacity for attention helps you retain memory.
I
Because
think
Mhm.
this is something that I've brought out numerous times, that there is this sort of a balance between the nerdier mindset and the more social mindset. And the more social mindset is you got to be able to come up with a quick little quip. And what does that have to do with? Being able to think very broadly, not very deeply, but very broadly about what's, what's the most socially minded, what's going to make people laugh, what's going to be something I can just come out with really quick. And that same sort of like breadth processing focus makes it where, I don't think that this loss of memory means that their brain is less powerful. I think it's just less unified and less capable of going of focusing on a task and to completion. But I'd be willing to bet they also have the ability to process a breadth of simultaneous things that is greater than people who have more concentration. And so they're just altering their mindset towards a specific methodology. And I think the that basically success in society now is not based upon performance as much as it is upon social climbing. And social climbing has a lot to do with that kind of more monkey perspective of the high school saying the right thing at the right time to stimulate the right people to see you in a better light. That it doesn't have to do with thinking something through, planning it out, staying focused upon it, and thinking all of the steps into the future. Your brain is more laterally organized instead of linearly organized. And I think we all have to have a balance, but then we can become extremely unbalanced in one direction or the other and lose though we gain capacities in one way, we lose the abilities in the other. And I think that that's our whole society now, because it is um, more based on social. Like I said, that's why it's making a lot of people lean extremely strongly towards the multitasking,
Mm-hmm.
simultaneous thought,
Mm-hmm.
being able to I guarantee you those people are more socially adept as well.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they really
Well, there's an
can,
image of a woman holding
yeah.
3 phones.
They can say the right thing at the right time to the right people, because they can think about,
Their thoughts.
10 people's, emotional proclivities, and how what the average of all of those would be to say the right thing in the right circumstance to please all of them simultaneously. And so those sorts of calculations, it's just a different mindset, and our the way we have set up our society now actually rewards that type of mind. But of course, they're losing things like the ability to focus on
Mm-hmm.
something, and you'll see that a lot of people who are multitaskers are also, they'll switch, and whenever they have difficulty, like in games, for instance, you'll encounter these people who will, the moment there's any difficulty, they'll turn aside.
Mm-hmm.
Now that, to those that,
Or leave the match or
yeah,
whatever.
exactly, they'll quickly give up. And in a situation where you are focusing to try to overcome something, there's a point at which trying to overcome something isn't as valuable as quickly switching to an alternative strategy. But then there are lots of times as well that if you are switching to alternative strategies, you're simply not focusing on something that would be valuable if you put enough work into it, and it would be of greater value and a more long-term value if you just stick with it through the difficulties. And so this sort of balance can become, whenever you hit those extremities, you have problems. And I think that our civilization is now focusing and narrowing people's um, brain type towards that breadth processing sort of perspective, and they're losing the ability to think more linearly, or they become so autistic they just have nothing but linear, thought process.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's basically making people go much more towards the edges and not be in a more balanced state. And people are specializing a tremendous amount towards very much to one end or very much to the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so speaking of specialization, um, actually, there's some evidence. So we're going to be talking about Thanksgiving, thankfulness, fun, all the food, fun, family, right? So the fun part of why I added that is essentially to focus on gratitude, thankfulness, and approach things in a fun new way, which actually can increase your enjoyment of life. There's a great article here on Psychology Today talking about to increase your enjoyment of old things, try this method. So essentially, the idea is well, let's start with an example. Remember the first time you tasted some wonderful new dish, or a new flavor of ice cream, or took the first sip of what is now your favorite drink? Do you still experience the same level of awe and thrill and enjoyment as you did then while you're consuming these foods now? Probably not. That's probably not what is happening. And so pay attention. Whenever you experience something new, pay attention to how it makes you feel. What do you experience? What are all these sensations in your body? How immersed are you in that moment? Well, people have tried to recapture that first time high through a variety of means. And mindfulness, for instance, is a really good way to do that, which is essentially mindfulness practice is not so much meditation as much, you don't just sit there, quietly thinking of nothing. Mindfulness is very active. It's quite the opposite. You actively pay attention to every little thing you do. In fact, we actually did a practice of this as part of my college course. It was a feminist narrative of Christian martyrs. It was interesting, actually. I enjoyed the class. The postmodernist class I hated, which was supposed to be anthropology, but the religious text learning through feminist lens was actually kind of great. I learned about a lot of crazy women in 15th century, etc., who did a lot of interesting things to the poor. But one of the things that we practiced, it was a very spiritual class, actually. I'm really thankful to that teacher for being a feminist, like feminists are supposed to be. If you're going to have any feminists at all, at least have the right, the good kinds of women, the good feminine, which is patient, nurturing, soft spoken, but also, she was no pushover, but she was very soft spoken, very spiritual, introduced things to me that help me to this day. So props to that professor. And one of the things that we did, other than drum circles, which was fucking great too, but we did mindfulness practice as the monks did in the books that we were reading. And one of the things that was a specific mindfulness practice with food is a very deliberate. Now, yes, think about what you're doing, but you can aid mindfulness through your physical activity, which is when you're eating, hold your fork as you normally would, like, or a spoon or whatever. Take a bite off of it, put it down, chew, pick it back up again, take another bite. Seems simple, but just that process alone is transformative. The simple act of putting down your fork in between bites extends your meal time, which is actually good because it does help digestion and other things. And it helps you feel more full, because one of the things that happens why you overeat is you eat very, very quickly. And when your stomach tells you that it's full, it's already too late. You're actually overstuffed when you're getting that I am full signal. So slower eating can help your body send those signals earlier and give you a more accurate time indicator of when you're actually full. And not to mention the spiritual or the mental effects that had. It really encourages introspection and contemplation, and it was a great mindfulness exercise. Simply by putting down your fork at lunch between bites, it was great. Now, there's other ways, and there's a particular study that we're talking about here from the Psychology Today article. It was a series of studies, actually, where authors examined whether eating food or watching videos in an unusual or in some way opposed to normal way can help people recreate that level of first time experience enjoyment. So, for instance, and it did. Spoiler, it did. So, they did a variety of studies. There's four of them, I believe, three or four. Yeah, four. And they did things like eating something in a novel way, drinking something in a novel way, and it actually helps improve your appreciation of it. And I don't know if it renews, if it like helps you concentrate on it better because you are doing something in a different novel way, so you're having to put more effort of thinking of how to do it. So a great example is eating popcorn with just your mouth, or like with sticking it into your tongue and putting it in your mouth instead of using your hands, or for drinking water or a drink, lapping it up like a cat instead of or drinking through a straw, just a crazy straw, like any kind of novel strange upside, like watching a video upside down, like just little weird ways in which you can approach a mundane task in a way that you never have before, actually has proven to be something that increases our enjoyment of it. So I think it has to do with concentration, thankfulness, or latent inhibition ultimately is what the at the bottom of it all is. And latent inhibition is, we've talked about that before in podcasts briefly, but it is essentially something that happens to your brains where you're sitting in a chair right now and you have clothes on your body, but I bet you're not feeling them. You don't constantly feel your clothes. You don't constantly feel what you sit on, your shoes on your feet. If you put your attention to it, you can feel it. But naturally, most of the time, our body just starts ignoring these things, and that's what is latent inhibition. They've done studies, of course, with
Your mind
animals.
starts ignoring them.
Yeah, your
That's the
mind.
important part
Right.
there, and it can do it with more than just physical things.
Exactly. Yeah. There have been things done with so many studies of making rats desensitized to a noise, of a variety of things where you can begin or smell. That happens to people who have cats, for instance, or other animals. Or if you work in a vet store, after a while, you stop noticing, or if you're a smoker, you stop noticing smells and sounds and ideas. You stop noticing things because you have latent inhibition about it. Your body goes, or your mind goes, oh yeah, I know that, and it just kind of goes past it. It fills it in with a pre-made thing, instead of having to spend the time on processing it every single time. It is essentially a conservation of energy. That's what biology is best at, conserving energy the best that it can. And so our brains do the same thing. They start ignoring things that we've decided one way or another, that it has decided is worthy of ignoring. So a great way to reawaken and get that dopamine and that fresh new experience sensation is by trying an old thing in a new way. That'll break your latent inhibition essentially. And there we've have studies proving that it works for humans. Now, thankfulness is another thing. That by itself, just focus. Once again, we're maintaining the concentration idea here. Focus, concentration on spending time, mind focus, essentially. Concentrating your mind on a particular concept. Um, Expressing gratitude lowers stress, builds social connection, and improves happiness. So with Thanksgiving around, past, and Christmas coming up, a lot of times we end up focusing on the goodies that we can get, on the food or on the presents or on the things we get, not things we give, and things that we're not necessarily thankful for the things we get either, because it's expected. You're expected to have a big meal at Thanksgiving that somebody prepares. You expect people to give you gifts.
It's so funny how in America we've made Thanksgiving exactly the opposite. It is the time in which you are the most gluttonous. And
the Black Friday thing's so weird.
And then you immediately go out and continue to try to fill some black hole that you're creating inside yourself, instead of being thankful for every small thing and focusing
thankful for what you have
thankfulness
instead of
and being satisfied.
Wanting what you have instead of having what you want.
Thankfulness is not encouraging in being insatiable. It's about being sated and being happy and satisfied with all of the good things in your life.
It's because some marketer,
because unhappy people buy more and enslave themselves more.
Yep, yes. Because marketers do psychology research first. That is who marketers are. They are psychologists. Somebody found.
What the comedian who's dead now? What's his name?
Bill Hicks.
Yes, Bill Hicks. So if you're a marketer, kill yourself. There's no joke. No, I'm not. There's nothing funny here. Kill yourself now.
It's great.
Oh, he was so right.
He was so right. That's the thing, because marketers use psychology to exploit people, to sell them things.
They don't know what they're doing.
I'm sorry. Let me rephrase. Marketers use psychology to make their product desirable to people, because that is their job. It is their job to make a product desirable.
Desire, which is to decrease satisfaction, which is to
some
make people
motherfucker
unhappy.
saw research that said that people are impulsive when they eat turkey, and he's like, Black Friday, bitches.
Well, no, people started just being impulsive. It probably was the other way around. Mm-hmm. People started being impulsive,
and then they noticed that their biggest day.
And so that's the day they need to focus on. And so it's usually
good point.
Whenever you try to focus on whether it was the chicken or the egg, you end up finding out that you're arbitrarily separating them, and it's both at the same time.
Yeah. But clearly, here was the turkey first. It was eating the turkey and getting that serotonin. I think I just inhaled some water. So that's fun.
Kitty, help us out.
But I am thankful for the fact that I'm not dead. So, speaking of gratitude, expressing gratitude is more than just an element of Thanksgiving tradition. It is a significant contributor to happiness and well-being. Of course, it is clearly set up by a religious practice. For instance, things like prayer, a lot of times encoded in prayer, or especially the before meal prayer, you thank God. You itadakimasu. Thank you for the food. You are thanking the people that made it, thanking God, thanking provider, thanking whatever. You are essentially, doesn't matter who you're thanking, you are being thankful. You're focusing and concentrating your mind on thankfulness. So there's a reason why there's so many religious practices that cultivate gratitude, because it can and does become a lifelong skill that can improve one's own joy. Very directly. Scientific literature views gratitude as acknowledgement that we've received something of value, and that it's the other's benevolence that gave it to us. So, I mean, think about the benefits of that. Not only are you feeling thankful for what you have, so you're feeling satisfied, you're increasing your own dopamine, your satisfaction, your happiness and well-being, but you are also seeing the other as a benefactor. That improves relations with others, that improves your expectations of others, which that can be a deciding factor in how a person will act. If you expect good of them or bad of them, that can
Or how
actually
you
affect.
look at society.
Or
Basically,
how
you
you,
end up
yes,
starting to feel more loved because you're
yes.
recognizing what is given to you, and then you become less of a cynic because cynical people are evil people. That's one of the things that people need to understand.
Cynical
Cynicism
cynicism
is
allows for bad behavior.
right. It makes you, the more cynical you are, the more you believe that every bad thing you do is justified because the other person deserved it. And that is really the essence of how good people do evil is cynicism. And understanding that thing, that cynicism is basically a descent into evil, is something that has never been properly called out in a wide enough
Format.
yeah, format. It is, you can very directly track how a person behaves towards other people based on the way that they see other people. If they decide that other people are deserving of ill, they are deserving of bad things, they are deserving, if anything, that those people need vengeance visited upon them, and they basically start seeing all of humanity in a way that for every single bad thing that ever happened to them by some person who did wrong, they
Mm-hmm.
then try to get justice on all the rest of humanity through this mechanism of cynicism and seeing other people as deserving of ill, and that you got to get yours before they get it from you, and basically seeing humanity in a bad fashion. That is the mental essence of aging. That's what
Mm-hmm.
aging, every
Back to
person
aging.
is constantly being tempted to become more and more and more cynical as they age. And an extremely aged mind is an extremely cynical mind. And an extremely cynical mind is an extremely evil mind. And that's the thing that people don't understand, where good people go bad.
Yeah.
That is how. That is the very source, the mechanism, the way it
Loss of
happens.
innocence.
It is the loss of innocence. And guess what? What is it that we've been talking about this entire time? That why a cell needs to die because it's lost innocence? Why it is that creatures die, and why death itself exists,
Loss
is
of
the
special
loss
of
of innocence through
generalization. Yeah.
over
Right.
specialization. And that's what cynicism is over specialization to negative events. And so basically the essence of death, of heading more and more into a death-like state, is cynicism. And so people need to understand this connection is crucial, that that's what an aged mind is. That's what a mind that eventually is more deserving of basically being eliminated because it is becoming a cancer in society, is a cynical mind.
Yep. And so, yeah, I love that aspect that when we express gratitude, we essentially acknowledge a link between ourselves and others. You cannot express gratitude without acknowledging that someone gave you something. Thankfulness is, in its very core, something that bridges a divide between people. So we essentially recognize someone else's actions that had a meaningful impact on our lives. And not only does that help you feel thankful to them, but it helps you feel loved by them. Because when you acknowledge that someone has done something for you, you acknowledge that they care about you. And so that's another life hack when you're feeling alone, lonely, unloved. Uh, Look at the little things, like somebody held the door open for you, a cashier smiled at you. Like, yeah, it's insignificant, but it could have been worse. Like it is them giving you something. You can be a tool to help you focus on, to improve your feelings of isolation. Now, clearly, this is a meaningful thing for relationships. We often view gratitude as an act of kindness towards other people. So we're by thanking them, we're sort of doing something for them in a way. But there's tangible benefits to the self uh, by being thankful. So scientific findings have shown that expressing gratitude towards others helps us cope better with stress. There's a study, for instance, in 2013 by Fredrickson that showed that expressing gratitude builds social bonds and establishes pro social behavior, which actually helps lower stress.
And
And
so that's the way that
mhm.
what we're talking about here is the mechanism by which selflessness becomes, it is a selfish thing
Hmm.
in a way that it
Because there's
provides for the
benefit
self,
for self. Yeah.
right? And that's what people don't typically focus on, is how there is a selflessness. There is a what's it called? They call it something in market economics where it's a rational
Hmm.
self-interest. The rational self-interest is being selfless many times, and that's the part of oversimplified game theory, where they had not
Hmm.
yet developed game theory
Yeah,
properly.
because
That's the part that they didn't
yeah,
grasp.
reciprocal altruism is what they were missing.
Yep.
And reciprocal altruism actually benefits both. It benefits the system. It benefits, by system I mean the group. It benefits those who cooperate. There's individual cooperation, individual competition, game theory, and then there's group competition, game theory. And so it was called evolutionary game theory because we are never alone. Nobody is ever an individual unto themselves, floating in the vastness of space and vacuum. That's just not a thing. We are fundamentally interconnected. So we are arranged in groups, whether it's your nuclear family, whether it's your school class, whether it's your local community, whether it's your
Well, your
political
dependence
party.
on civilization itself. All these
Yes.
people who think that they're independent and they're utterly dependent upon civilization. It's just there's this extremely unrealistic ideology that goes with rugged individualism. It's
Hmm.
like, yeah, you're not nearly as individual as you think you are, and your lack of thankfulness, it makes you a shitty person when you're not thankful for exactly how much it is all of these other people are providing for you.
Yep. In addition, too, though, we're talking about societies in general or groups, and especially the climate that we live in currently. Expressing gratitude can actually reduce negative social comparisons. And if anything, especially the younger people, I feel like that is the biggest struggle to self esteem, therefore mental health, that we have currently is everyone's incentives to create the most attractive version of themselves in their lives to put up for public consumption, and that can create envy and negative social comparison and a focus on who has a better position, who doesn't, and that sort of social minded, hierarchy minded stress and envy can be extremely detrimental to health. For instance, rather than looking up at better off others with jealousy and things like that, when you are thankful for things in your life, gratitude can actually help reduce envy, helps build joy, and then you just don't even care about those who, you're not so worried about what other people are doing because you are satisfied and happy in your life. You're not looking for something else and seeing other people have it and then begrudging them for it. Um, and this, has other implications as well. Spiritual leaders like Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, and others essentially credit and advocate for thankfulness as a lifelong happiness, an element of lifelong happiness. Now, of course, focusing on others' benevolence rather than their possessions or positions, expressing gratitude, can reduce materialistic strivings and increase our concern for each other's welfare as people. So, essentially, by focusing on what other people do for you, you kind of start to forget what everyone has and just focus on being there for each other, which I feel like we really need in this current climate. There's actually considerable research shown that a focus on materialism leads people to experience less life satisfaction, have lower self esteem, and greater depression. And that was done by Kasser and Canner in 2003. So, like, we've known this since 2003, people. Essentially, by reflecting on social benevolence, we can think less about things and focus more on our connection to each other.
You know what's funny is all the things that we're talking about are the virtues that are usually, uh, exhorted in most religions,
Yep.
and there's a reason
It-
why religion was
It's written about, not necessarily
successful,
practiced.
right? Why it was useful, why it continued for such a
Why
long
it
period of time,
survived, yeah.
because of its benefit to society. That's the reason why, and that's why we see these things as general moral goods, because there is a mechanism by which they work. They're
To bring
effective
happiness to
problem
everyone.
solving strategies for complex phenomena of civilization.
Yep. So how do we do this? How do we thankful? How do you thankful? Well, from personal experience, and more than personal experience, but my training in neuropsychology, writing things down, or praying at night, or essentially going over a list of things that you're thankful for before bed every night, that can make a world of difference. So essentially, what Psychology Today recommends here, let's see what they say. So one, set aside a few minutes to count one's blessings and write them down. Yes, I completely agree with that. Literally just listing the positive things in your life and then actively thinking about them, reflecting on them, can enhance gratitude and positive definition of yourself. That you can actually feel like you have something worth living for, that you have things that are going well for you. It doesn't matter if it's little, if it's just your cornflakes tasted good that morning, just anything at all that brought you joy or that made you feel blessed. Or if you think about what are the things that you're thankful for, that you would have a worse life if you didn't have them, or people, what activities, what have you. I would recommend doing this before bed, but you can do it at any time, at lunch, whenever, or maybe when you're feeling stressed or lonely or alone. And that actually is the hardest time to do it in, but you get the most benefit out of doing it then. Now, two, what did they say? Write a couple of gratitude letters and visit the recipients to read the letters out loud to them. Oh my God, I'm getting emotional just reading this. Ah, wow. Imagining actually doing that, I'm literally overcome with tears. I feel like that could be a really, really strong thing to do, particularly towards men in your life, which could be a little awkward because men are awkward when it comes to expressions of emotion around them, but that doesn't mean they won't gain a great deal from you doing it. So yes, I agree with that recommendation. Definitely write a letter of gratitude, and don't just send it to them, but yeah, go over and read it out loud. And I guarantee you there will be tears, hugs, oxytocin. It'll be beautiful. And if there isn't, cut that person out of your life. Um,
I don't know about
and we'll be
that.
talking about that later. No, no, I mean, like, when you have to realize that people will act awkward when they don't know what to do with their emotions. So don't read too much into it. But when you come at someone, particularly a woman, when you come at someone and you express your gratitude to them and you show them, you bare your soul to them and your emotions, and they meet it with a stony silence or in some way brushing it off, that can tell you more than you may have wanted to know about that person, which I think is beneficial. But I don't think that's something you need to worry about. I feel like I just want to
Yeah, you're
put
talking about an
exactly.
exceptional
I want to put that out there
circumstances.
just in case that does happen, and you're going to be mad at me because I told you to do this and then it didn't work out. But at least you learned something about them. But I highly doubt that'll be a common thing. I'm pretty sure it's going to be an exception. Now, third thing they suggest is invest in others. Research by Dunn in 2008 shows that spending money on others rather than on oneself maximizes happiness. The research shows that spending even small amounts of money, $5 to $20, on others makes people happier than spending the same amount of money on oneself. So patreon.com/Anna Cherry. Help out this podcast for you. Give us money for yourself. Science says that's what it is. That's gonna do it.
It's
It's science,
scientifically
man.
supported.
Yep. When we spend money on others for even small things, such as buying a friend a coffee, leaving an anonymous flower on a coworker's desk, it not only brightens somebody else's day, but it actually improves our own well-being too. And I personally experienced this with tipping. Now, I'm against tips in general because I believe restaurants should be paying their workers a livable wage. But if we have a minimum basic income, that won't be a problem. Um, but I did read an article that I've never really been a waitress that, especially at the time when I didn't need money when I was a waitress. I did it for funsies at the Flying Saucer. If anyone knows the Flying Saucer, shout out. Great uniforms for their bar girls. But yeah, I didn't need money, so I was just doing it for funsies. So it didn't really matter if I got tipped or not. However, I read an article from that was essentially a perspective of people who are living, working waiters and waitresses, and something really stuck with me since then, where it demonstrated how much someone's day can be made with just $35 extra or what have you. Um, having a tip, a larger than 15% tip, just that alone can make someone feel so much better than they were feeling. And I crave to make people feel better than they were feeling. So I get obsessed sometimes with leaving a larger than necessary tip, particularly if there was service that was good, because I know that will make their day, and that gives me joy. I do it for me. I don't really do it for them. I do it for me. It also makes me feel rich when I just give big tips, especially when I have no money. It really alleviates the stress of lack of finances and things like that. The stress that comes with financial issues. We all been there. It really, really alleviates that stress when I just give. Which is counterintuitive because it's like, well, you have less money. Why would you feel better? It's magic of investing in others, I guess. Now, speaking of people who you may need to cut out of your lives, but can't because they're family.
No, you need to stop talking about that. That's it's that's so specific to
Yeah, to
particular
very
individuals and
particular
particular
cases.
cases that it's not
But it
something
just
you
so happens that our audience does tend to be skewed towards those people.
people who've been abused. Yes,
Yes, we
but
right. I There is a particular approach,
it's so
and it's such an exception.
yeah, exactly. It's better. It's so much better to promote connection
Hmm.
than to promote disconnection.
Well, this is what this is about. It is essentially holiday strategies for dealing with difficult family members. It is a ways to help you have patience with others, with yourself, and get the benefits of that social connection, even if when things aren't super perfect. And I really appreciate pundits and political talking heads or the commentators on the alternative media sites like YouTube and others, who try to bridge that divide between the political parties or between ideologies or what have you, because ultimately at the end of the day we all need each other. We're all still people, and it's so much better to come together and even have disagreements, or hash out disagreements, or not even worry about it and just focus or bond on things that you do have in common. It can be important at times to delineate what is valuable ideas, what isn't, but a lot of times it's very subjective. There's very little research and any kind of science that you can point to that is being provided by the political opposition parties. You're really not getting any here's evidence why my position is better. It's all of it is just virtue signaling and feels and emotions and opinions and beliefs that are based on tradition and opposing traditions. There's really no strong evidence that is being presented by either side a lot of times. So just both of you shut the fuck up and hug. Like, don't worry about it. Like, forget about those things that you want to disagree on and find things that you can agree on, because at the end of the day, that is just a better way of being. That is a better strategy. So here are some ways to help you out, how to deal with difficult family members, particularly with Christmas coming up, or if you're still traveling or involved with family, or if you're dealing with PTSD over Thanksgiving weekend. If you spend time with family and you're feeling lower than you have before, because of interaction with people that may have attitudes and ideas about you and life that are just not compatible with what you need to stay happy. Um, Here are some things you can employ to sort of work out some of that pain, or some of that stress that you experienced, and maybe look at some of the experience you had in a different light. Maybe try to find ways to have patience for them. So here's some strategies. We got five and a half strategies. So the first one is the empathy strategy, and I'm a big proponent of that one. If you can, try to do that. Try to do the empathy strategy. So how you do that is you anticipate potential areas of conflict, prepare and practice a calm and simple level-headed response based on empathy rather than defensiveness. So I don't have like an easy example for that, but essentially, if somebody is judging your choice on not having family, for instance. Like, if you know, a grandmother or whoever is like, oh, when are you going to give me grandkids? Like, you know, when are you going to find somebody? Like, let's say something like that. You can see it through an empathy perspective of, oh, this person believes that their entire value, that their whole benefit to society, that their whole value as a person has to do with producing children or finding a mate, or and that's sad. That's sort of, you can sort of look at it as like, oh, you're just imposing your own insecurities on me. And
And that's that. And if you can see a person's innocence
yeah,
instead of it as an attack, and realize they're just so focused on their own thoughts, they
right.
can't. That sometimes they just don't have room to understand how it affects you. It's just not even there. It's not. It's they can't see it as much as, like, they're completely blind to it, and understanding that idea of them being utterly perfectly completely blind to what they're doing is difficult, but if you can do it, it helps with a level of forgiveness that is beneficial to you.
Well, they give an example. That's good. Good for them. That's actually a great example. So let's say, speaking of fasting and diet and all that, let's say your diet means you can't eat some of your family's traditional holiday food. And so you anticipate that there's going to be a criticism. Actually, I personally deal with this whenever I visit my family. They give me rash shit for not eating meat. So instead of getting angry that they're disrespecting you and your choices, you can consider the fact that they may be feeling hurt because you are rejecting them. You're not only rejecting what they made for you, which is kind of hurtful because they spent the time making it, but they can also see that as a criticism of who they are, particularly with diet. People take that shit personally. So they can essentially see it as either rejection or criticism of who they are, because you're saying, no, I will not do this thing that you all are doing. That can be hella hurtful. So you
You
could,
think you're better than me?
exactly. So you can think of it as like, and here's an example of what they give. So you can diffuse a situation by pleasantly saying something like, although I don't eat X, I appreciate that you continue our family holiday traditions, and my diet doesn't change how happy I am to be part of this family, so let's not let it come between us. Beautiful. Well done. Gorgeous. Love it. And yeah, I would highly recommend this strategy for just all day, every day. This has been one of the most transformative things for me personally in letting go of cynicism, in growing as an intellectual, essentially being able to grow as a person and in your knowledge, requires not just empathy, but also the flip side of empathy is allowing for being wrong. So that's essentially what you're doing by empathizing with others. You are, instead of saying, I am right, my opinion is the only opinion, what I think is the truth, that can sometimes be detrimental to growth. So, a lot of times. So, what you can do is instead consider that there may be another opinion, another approach, another way of looking at it. And that by itself can actually help with latent inhibition that I mentioned earlier. It can help with increased brain plasticity. A variety of things get baked into this approach to life that I recommend to everyone. And ultimately, okay, let's say someone is an asshole and they're doing a lot of bad things. You don't have to forgive their behavior. You can still condemn and not associate and not do yourself behaviors that you find bad. But the person you can still empathize with.
And empathizing with them will make it where you can more readily recognize how it is that they got to that shitty place where they
Mm-hmm.
think that their behavior is okay. And if you can then identify what it is that they are thinking that allows them to think that that behavior is okay, and you can really get into it and see it from their perspective, that they think what they're doing is good and not bad, then that allows you to escape the trap that they have fallen into. And that's what's important, is that you not fall into the exact same traps because you see them in some simplistic fashion of, oh, they're just evil and I would never, which is bullshit. Instead, you can see the mechanisms that get them to the place that where they are, where they're doing the things that they are doing, and then you can really actually avoid them instead of through some bullshit, idealization of who you are. You can instead see it for what it really is and avoid the trap.
And that I would never aspect is how we end up with the horseshoe between feminists and certain um, meninists, let's say, because they're not exactly men's rights activists, but the red pill, the black pill, the sort of that the incels, actually, the black pill incel community. A lot of times when you read their stuff, it's like one of those, who said this? Did a feminist say this, or did I? It's like Sargon used to play that game, Nazi or feminist. It's kind of like that with some black pill individuals and feminists, radical feminists. You have a horseshoe. Why? Because they refuse to empathize with the other, and those who have the capability to empathize should. So I don't know if rad femmes have the capacity to empathize, but I would hope that maybe some people on our side can still do that, and look at it and essentially don't be afraid to empathize. You will not lose your judgment of their behavior. Don't worry about it, because there's two ways in which you judge behaviors and stand up against behavior. You have an emotional reaction to it that says no, that's wrong, and then you have a cognitive reaction that says no, that's wrong because of all of these different things. So what you're doing is you're getting rid of that knee-jerk emotional reaction by empathizing with others. But of course the horseshoe happens because we say no, they're feminist and I would never be like that because I'm not a feminist. It's like, yes, but you're still falling prey to the same mental traps in logic and reasoning and emotionality that they do. So if you can empathize with how they got there, you can yourself better see the same pitfalls in your own reasoning. And then all you're left with is your rational view of they're wrong because they hurt society like this, and this. But getting rid of that emotional knee jerk, they're evil, I hate them, they're the other, they suck. That's extremely beneficial to your own personal growth, I would say. So, yeah, don't worry that you will suddenly become a feminist lover or whatever because you empathize with the other. It won't happen. Trust me, it won't. What all you're doing is getting rid of that toxic emotional reaction that we all need to have less of. We all get these judgy, emotional, the other reactions to things, and goal is to lessen them as much as possible and to only have our rational, slower thinking involved, not the instant, quippy, like instantaneous decision making. In fact, what we need to focus on is the more long term, slower, deeper, thorough thinking and critical thinking and rationally looking at something. So, if someone is truly wrong, if their behavior, if their attitudes are truly wrong, and you can list how they are, that's all you need. You don't need to have an emotional reaction that they're bad. Like, you don't need that. That actually impedes their growth.
So it's much more important to really, like, most people, they think that they empathize when they just say, "Oh, I'm empathizing. I see that they're evil." It's like, I'm empathizing that they're crazy. No, that's not empathy. Empathy is really seeing it from a perspective where you can say, "Yeah, I would do the same thing under that sort of thought process and that sort of." If I think about this for a second, if I could see, like, for instance, that they're getting even, that they're taking revenge, and they feel, and things where you would really see how your feelings would lead you in the wrong direction, and you can feel it too. That's like, okay, I can feel that. I can feel how that's actually empathy, and that is what the process that gets you to understand how their thought process goes wrong. And being able to do that is not a common thing, and people who a lot of times people don't understand how to do it at all. They just do it, and so being able to practice doing that is an important part of improving your own um, strategy. I guess is the best way to put it. Improving your own ability to not become the thing that you believe is wrong.
Yep. So, yeah, a lot of these, even though they seem to be for the benefit of the other, they actually end up benefiting yourself. There's a reason why love, altruism, things like that, why they've existed and
Judge
lasted
not
and
lest she
brought
be
us here.
judged. All those things, all
Yep,
those
yep,
attitudes
yep.
from religion, they have a reason for existing. They actually were beneficial. There was something that they were talking about that made sense, and just because it doesn't immediately occur to you why it makes sense doesn't mean there isn't a mechanism.
Yep. Now, that's the best strategy, I think, the empathy strategy. Now, they have a few more options. Number two, the shut it down strategy. And that can work with some of your more aggro family members. So, if you anticipate negative comments about your appearance, politics, gender identity, sexual orientation, anything else, you may want to prepare and practice a simple but tactful phrase to douse that spark. So try to deliver your message in a smooth, pleasant tone, and don't just like that's another trick too. Is or how to essentially they keep mentioning say things in a pleasant way. Well, how do you do that? How do you say things in a pleasant way when you're pissed? Like how do you? And a lot of times, if you say things that you think you're sounding nice, you end up sounding passive aggressive. People end up seeing through it. So what you have to do is you have to actually mentally reorient and realign yourself, and you have to mentally go, okay, actually try to feel pleasant in your mind. If you have to think of it as talking to someone else other than your dad or whoever, or whatever it is, try to substitute that person with another person that you would not have this reaction to. Whatever you got to do to actually feel pleasant in your mind. So the way to shut it down, and I've had to do this personally as well when it came to our sex work, for instance. My parents are chill with it, but they still sometimes will bring it up and be like, why do you have to do that? So gotta shut it down. You go like, example, dad, it's not a lifestyle choice. It's not a lifestyle choice. It's who I am, or whatever. That's shitty. Why would you say it's not a lifestyle choice? You're allowed to have your lifestyle choices, essentially. But they're saying, Dad, it's not a lifestyle choice. It's who I am. But let's move on so we can have a nice holiday. Or I can't say I agree with you, but let's put it aside and focus on having a good holiday. So essentially, that's just be like, okay, let them know that some topics are off the table. You'd be like, sorry,
The lifestyle choice is a reference to homosexuality.
I realize that, but still, like, what's wrong with saying this is my lifestyle choice? Fucking accept it. You know, like I
Yeah,
don't
it's
see
true,
why
exactly.
that's a problem.
Well, because in certain cases they want to express how much
It
it
is
is
intrinsically who they are.
right.
Which, I mean, to be fair, porn is my lifestyle choice, but it is who I am. I am a nudist. I want to arouse people. Like it's both. I like to be naked for many reasons. I crave it. It is who I am. so so yeah. But you have to do that sometimes. So you can just tell them, look, certain topics are off the table. I'm sorry if you keep pushing it. You are. Why are you doing this? Do you not want to have a good holiday? Do you want to have a fight? Do you want to disrespect me? Can we just please not talk about some things? And so that could be a good shut it down strategy for if empathy doesn't work, which sometimes it can't because people are just set in their ways and they have no real reason to believe what they believe. And
Yeah, and sometimes you just the strategy for there is basically break out of the conversation
yeah,
and talk about the conversation. Don't engage in the conversation, talk about the conversation itself. And so you say, okay, so what exactly are we going to accomplish here? How is this going to benefit us? What is the value of this conversation we are having right now? And if you can, a lot of times, whenever somebody is trying to engage you emotionally, or not even trying to engage you emotionally,
but ends up
they
engaging.
are engaging you emotionally. You have to
The
stop talking
topic
in the conversation and start talking
about.
about the conversation.
Yep, good. That's really good advice.
And so there it starts becoming, you know, you stop thinking about what they're saying and start thinking about what they're doing with the words.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's the important part of kind of breaking an emotional engagement.
Yep. So that's related to that. If you can't exactly shut it down when it's an elder or in a variety of ways, that'll might cause more problems by saying, let's not talk about this time. I just egg them on. You know, you have a variety of people. So we have to account for all different types of people. So another strategy, number three, is to be like a duck. Let it roll off your back like water on a duck. Now, sometimes, it is unfair to sour the holiday experience for everybody by getting into it with just one single contentious family member. Like, it's not your fault either, but once you engage in a back and forth, then you are both involved. You are then half responsible for what's going on. Sure, they may have started it, but you are continuing it. So, this is a difficult one, but some of us have practiced at this, and this could be a good opportunity for you to practice. So, Being a duck is easier if you don't personalize offensive or hurtful comments. So it's sort of like the empathy strategy, but without thinking too much about that other person, because sometimes they're just unempathizable with in some ways. You just, sometimes the divide is just too different, particularly between generations. There's certain particularities that you just, and they're older, they're stuck in their ways. There's just a variety of things that you can't, empathy alone won't just bash through. Empathy alone isn't enough. Like, sure, you empathize with them, but it still hurts, right? So what do? Um, Try to not personalize it and remind yourself it really isn't about you. It really isn't. It's so not about you. You can use soothing self statements, things that you say to yourself, or if you have a happy place, even, or whatever. Deep breaths. Actually, it's surprising how much you can alleviate anxiety by input of oxygen. Just taking a big deep breath can actually help. And you can say self statements like, "She has an alcohol problem. She says hurtful things when she's drunk. It's not about me." Or, "He is old fashioned. Today I'll give him a pass." Preparation definitely also helps here.
And there is also kind of a feel when you're being the bigger man, there's kind of a feeling of superiority that takes you out of it, where you feel like you're dealing with a child, and so it's like you can forgive a child who's being a naughty little shit, because it's like, oh, whatever, who cares?
They're undeveloped.
It's exactly, and so though you don't want to continue to always be feeling superior, there is a time and place for things where it's like when you're being the bigger man, you're being the bigger man. That's all there is to it. And when you're,
By
and so
definition.
so you are factually being more, even if it's your parent, you're being more the parent. And that's that, just kind of understanding that
That
there
could
are
be very
times.
satisfying.
Yes, it can be satisfying and calming, and also lead you to more loving behavior. Because a good parent, now don't be a shit parent. If you're going to put yourself in that position, then be a good parent. And a good parent is a loving, patient, type of character, not a I'm bigger than you, so I can shove you around and you're worthless. That's not a good parent. So,
Yep. So speaking of not good parents, or no, if you perhaps had some siblings that you grew up with, or there's cousins, or just friends that you can use. Strategy number 4 is the buddy system. So stay close to someone who can serve as a buffer between you and a challenging family member, and who you can have fun with. So having just a little extra support that you've agreed to beforehand, to, like, stay close to your buddy, and that can help a lot too, to help you feel connected, and that someone's on your side, and that you won't feel so hurt by the attacks, because essentially what these attacks do is they make you feel alone and isolated from your social group, which to our instinctual selves means death. We cannot survive on our own. We haven't been able to, well, currently we can't survive on our own without civilization. You just can't. So, yeah, it's one of those things that activates that primal fear of isolation. And as gregarious animals, that is one of the biggest threats. So having a buddy can really help you feel connected. Strategy number 5, stay away. Yeah, the holidays are about family, but having healthy boundaries sometimes may mean staying away. That's for those cases where you just are in a bad place, or you're still overcoming some things,
and
and your
sometimes
mental
there's
health
just
or
a thing.
sobriety can't
Yeah,
handle it.
sometimes the holiday itself is a toxic mix, and what
Hmm.
you can do is, if you don't want to, you don't want to feel bad about
Because
not
people are
visiting with family,
stressed.
but you also don't want to deal with that whole holiday of where there's too many things that they're stressing about, getting the food done on time and it getting cold, and all the just the
All the
dumb
different
shit that
people and the,
happens
yeah.
with trying to coordinate some big
Yep.
event, and you just don't want to deal with that. You can, instead of feeling bad about it, you can promise yourself to visit later, and just don't make the holiday. Make a holiday.
Come
Sure,
before the holiday,
make
come
a holiday
after.
visit where you
Yeah,
are like, for
your own
sometimes,
holiday on your
right,
own terms.
yeah, it's on your own terms. It's in a position where it's less stressful, where it's not, you don't have to do a certain thing at a certain time. We're all, and there's all this coordination bullshit that's stressing everybody out. Instead, making it less formal, but still, getting the thing done that the holiday is supposed to do. That way you don't have to feel guilty about skipping it, and you can still promise yourself that it's like, okay, there's kind of I haven't seen them in a while, I should, do this mandatory visit thing, but at least you can eliminate some of the other shit. So you can promise yourself to still do the holiday visit, but just not necessarily on the holiday itself.
Yep. And some of us, particularly
Or just
some,
don't do it at all.
yeah.
It's like sometimes there is a time to just stay away and make a call if you need to, or just don't feel obligated. Sometimes if it's just so toxic that all it does is bring them down, bring you down, then you need to look at the overall good for both of you. And that is sometimes to not, if you have cut off family because it was absolutely necessary, sometimes that is, while it's difficult, you need to understand it is the best thing if that is what you've had to do.
Yep. And I feel like some of our viewers in particular, some patrons even, have an experience of the guilt. Guilt is such a powerful weapon, especially I feel like men really are susceptible to guilt a lot of times, and so you feel obligated to do these things, and you may not even be aware of how toxic it is, but you may be quite aware of how toxic it is, but you're still are feeling compelled by the guilt, and so you're stuck in this decision making process of what do I do? Do I allow the guilt to control my behavior and alleviate that pain, and give my family something that they may want, or do you do what's necessary for yourself? What do you do? So here's some things that you can ask yourself to help you figure out what decision do you make, to help you figure out whether or not it's worth maintaining your mental health as it is, or if you can take a hit of seeing the family and dealing with that, and thereby alleviating the guilt and knowing that you were a good son or whatever. So which of course is ridiculous. I believe, and everybody struggles with this, I think, who have parents that they may have had difficult relations with at times. You
Yep.
feel guilty.
Let me interject something
Hmm.
here. It's like you are talking about what the guilt is, has to do
Right.
with self value, which has to do with these deep seated things
Right.
that are
Feeling
connected to
valued by,
family
yes.
and feeling valued by people. And so it is okay to be selfish about charity. Understand that, that it's just like you enjoy giving a hug as much as getting it. There's nothing wrong with enjoying getting a hug, but when you're giving one. And the same thing is true of charity and things like that. That there is absolutely zero. That idea that you shouldn't gain any pleasure from charitable acts is fucking stupid. You need to have pleasure. You need to have reward from doing things that are good and right and valuable. And so one of the things that you can do to boost your self-esteem in place of, if you're wanting to still feel the love and companionship of human connection, is actually doing some sort of charity work and feeling good about yourself for bringing some happiness to other human beings. And so there
Sorry, I
is
can't come to dinner, Mom. I'm volunteering at the soup kitchen.
exactly. And oh my God, you could even do that. So there's nothing, no, not the slightest, tiniest hint of taint to feeling good about doing what is right. You should
It
always feel
makes you
good.
feel good. That's
You
what
should
it
make sure to
neurochemically
feel
does.
good about doing what's right. And
Yeah.
the value that you get from doing charity work should be, you should revel in it, you should enjoy it, and you can use that as a alternative.
Because you know what? More charity work needs to be done. So, if feeling good about yourself is going to boost more work being done for those who need it, like veterans, like homeless, who are often veterans, do it.
Yeah, my God, the number of homeless people who are veterans is absurd.
Yeah, I will actually probably link some veteran help things in the low bar. In fact, once I find it, as well as a Patreon post, because if anyone needs help
But
and
then
deserves it, it's
there's also
people.
nursing homes
Yep.
where they
Older.
need, right, older communities. There's a lot of people who you can do.
Children, you can mentor, the big brothers and sisters club.
Yeah, so there's a variety of ways in which you can find something that will basically give you
Hell, pets,
human,
animals.
yeah, well,
You still work with other
it's
humans who
still,
love
yeah,
animals.
right, but
Yeah.
there's something to also
Volunteering
connecting
at the
with
pet
other
shelter.
human beings, and that can be valuable. So
They did that for 4th of July. A bunch of people, instead of celebrating, they all went down to the pet shelter to keep company to the dogs that are scared by the fireworks. So, yeah. So there's pictures of just a bunch of people hanging out next to crates of puppies. So yeah, that because you meet like-minded people when you volunteer. Another thing I would suggest is meetups. For instance, I signed up to meetups, and I constantly get emails about a thing in my area about help with public speaking, a fucking brunch group, gaming and beers night. Like, there's so many meetups. People crave to get together, and you can do that very easily through meetups. But back to the family bit with the guilt. If you're having to struggle with guilt, which essentially what guilt is fear of loss of social connection. Once again, we're back to that fear
Yeah,
of
that's where
lack of
guilt.
connection.
If you look at evolutionary terms, the reason why human beings experience guilt has to do with social, social connection.
Yep. So you can ask yourself questions like, is my mental health or sobriety solid enough to handle a situation? Do I have a strong support system in the form of a therapist, family member, friends, romantic partner, someone who'll be there for me through this or after this? And what is my current level of stress, and do I need to downtime during the holidays? So those are three simple questions. Try to assess how strong are you at the moment, assess if you have any kind of support group, and assess how stressed you are. And if all of those come up green, then you can go ahead and try to engage and go towards the side of spending time with family. If all of those are coming up red, it's not worth it. It's going to make
Yeah,
you
you
feel
may make
bad. It's
things
going to make
worse.
them feel bad. It's going to make, yeah, your relationship worse, perhaps, depending on how stressed you are. You could, because, like they say in space, you can't, nothing is so bad that can't be made worse. So, um,
At family gatherings, nothing is so
yes,
bad that it can't be made worse.
exactly.
It's like
So
space.
it's just like space. And lastly, get very intoxicated strategy. No, kidding. Avoid the get very intoxicated strategy. Getting a little intoxicated can help ease the holiday, but sometimes, most of the time, people drink to excess
Yeah,
when they're
and if
stressed,
you're prone
and
to drink to excess,
you will.
if you pull to the right, shoot left. If you are prone to get intoxicated more than you intend, then expect that you will in a stressful situation like your family, and just don't do it. Don't start. And it's kind of like the don't go and buy the sweeties at the store, and you won't have to worry about whether or not you have the willpower later. It won't be there for you to have willpower. Same thing with just don't. Just don't even start.
Yep, so your ability to act maturely, choose your words carefully, and override your defensiveness is all shot to hell and compromised by intoxication, especially extreme intoxication. And when you have multiple people that are extremely intoxicated, on one hand, yeah, everyone may forget that what happened, but on the other hand, you can end up in a fight, and it's just
It
like
can be
cops can get
terrible.
called, and yeah, it's just
It
not
can be,
what you want.
yeah, exactly. In some circumstances, it can be life altering.
Right. So, try to avoid that. And if you need some dopamine source, get you a buddy. If you don't have a buddy, just fucking go and emotionally eat. Just fucking do it. Like, if you're having an intoxication problem, and you're aware of that, just load up on sugar and fat
That
and
one time.
protein that one time. Just go ahead and do
That's
what
it.
you gotta do.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes,
Get a puppy or something to cuddle.
planning to screw up your diet is better than
Feeling guilty about having done it
yeah,
unintentionally. Yeah. So yeah,
sometimes,
sometimes.
sometimes.
And then, of course, we have an article about willpower. Willpower doesn't work. Here's the key to being more productive according to neuroscience. And we will be talking about that with our patrons in the after show. Now, whoever is our patron is watching us right now, you're gonna be getting an invite in the Discord room, which Discord is free for everyone to join. However, we have special super secret rooms for patrons only, and there will be a
You have to
link.
bomb the wall to get into them.
Yes.
That's from Zelda. Sorry. The secret rooms. If they're a little it happens. It's great. Yeah.
There you go. That's exactly what happens. So yeah, you have to smash all the pottery and bomb through the wall.
And that's how you get in the super secret room in Discord.
Yep. And we'll be getting our patrons in through a Patreon post directly with the link, as well as Discord. And if you are not yet a patron, go ahead and become one. I highly suggest checking out a tier called Challenger. It is the one that directly supports this podcast and allows us to make more of it. You get other goodies along with it. Of course, if you want higher tiers, there's even more awesome rewards. However, word of advice, word of warning, hardcore tier, there's a reason it's called that. Things start getting naked after the hardcore tier. Challenger tier is mostly lewds, non-nudes. Your virgin eyes are going to be safe. Your wife's not going to be mad. It's all pretty much.
Well, can't guarantee that.
No, I can't guarantee that. It's all pretty much PG-13, maybe NC-17 sometimes, but once you get into hardcore mode, it's all nude, all not safe for work all the time. So that's that. And we are now going to go into a patron after show. Eventually, I would like to record these. I just realized I can have an unlisted hangout with patrons so that other patrons can rewatch that. Awesome. In December, starting in December, we're going to be doing that. So get your buttholes ready for that.
Lube up. It's coming.
Starting next month.
That's it, man.
You're gonna have some replays available.
Hardcore replays. All the something, I don't know.
Challenger replays, not quite hardcore, but
okay.
Unfortunately, I actually can't have hardcore replays because it's an unlisted YouTube video and they're not so cool with nudity. Not mine anyway. So, but Challenger, since I'm mostly clothed during these, it's all good. So that's what we're going to be doing starting in December.
We'll have Galileo in there and take off his collar and advertise it as naked pussy.
Mm-hmm. That's right. All right. Thank you very much for listening and being active participants. Feel free to support the podcast directly by joining Patreon or support each individual stream by donating to Streamlabs and have your comments read out loud if you do that. We are aiming to have bi-monthly cherry stems, ideally every week. We're still working up to that. Haven't quite hit our Patreon goal for that, but that's okay. We're doing it anyway.
Probably have to not do 3-hour long ones.
Yes, that's probably the case. We got into this fasting thing for quite a bit longer than I expected, but I enjoyed it. So hopefully you did too. And we will see you all in the after show. And thank you for watching. Good night.